I'm going to go ahead and call the City Council regular meeting for Tuesday, June 4th, 2019 to order. Madam City Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Karen Moran.
Present.
Cornish.
Present.
Councilmember Jason Ritchie.
Here.
Councilmember Chris Ross. Present. Councilmember Pamela Stewart. Councilmember Ramiro Valderrama.
Present.
Okay, Madam City Clerk, we do have a quorum. Councilmember Hornish, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I'd be
please?
proud to. Please stand and join me in our pledge to the best flag in America, in the world. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, to entertain a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 6-0, the agenda is approved. Next, we have public comment. This is an opportunity for the public to address the council, 3-minute limit per person, or 5 minutes if representing the official position of a recognized community organization. If you would like to show a video or PowerPoint, it must be submitted or emailed by 5 p.m. end of business day to the City Clerk, Melanie Anderson at manderson@sammamish.us. Please be aware council meetings are videotaped and available to the public. First, I have Mark Cross.
Here in Sammamish. Nice to see our new city council, our new city manager in the chair over there. I wanted to talk about Zakus Basin tonight, but you pushed that to July. But I will talk about transportation improvement planning because I think it applies to Thompson Road that I live off of for the last 32 years. You've been struggling mightily and have a kind of come in alignment on transportation impacts, and I think that there's 3 things that are going to happen to our neighborhood, Thompson Road, which is a minor arterial in the transportation plan in the next 5 years, which are 6 years of the TIP. One, that the East Lake Sammamish Trail is going to be completed, which when I was on council, I got included a link from the bottom of Thompson Hill Road right onto the trail. So that'll become a major place for pedestrians and bicyclists to enter and exit the trail who are coming up to the center of the city. The second thing that's going to happen is the town center in some form. Hopefully you will have fixed some of the transportation, and some of that's going to move forward. And that's going to put more focus on Thompson Road along with the other development that's happening in the town. And we do not have a sidewalk. And when you look at the Zakus Basin, there's a basin plan that talks about, well, we'll put a trunk storm line into that street, but no sidewalk is mentioned. And so that's really where we start to, I have 2 comments. One is that Thompson Road is going to need a sidewalk, and it needs a bicycle climbing lane so that it can really form that core of non-motorized access to the center of the city. 2, doing basin plans, it's proposed, would become a model for doing other basins in the city, which is fine, but I think you really need to think about doing more of a neighborhood type plan where you would address transportation, storm drainage, urban forestry, future sidewalks, future park and recreational facilities, so that a neighborhood in this crazy world that we're living in can have a better sense of what your policy direction is for their neighborhood and how it is laid out in the future, rather than going in different silos of transportation and then parks and then urban forestry, and taking my degree in urban planning to like fuse them all together and try to understand what policy direction you, the council, have given us. And I think that policy direction is better and better implemented if all the different disciplines that you talk about on different nights is fused into neighborhood plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I have Mary Wichter.
I have a question for the city manager that he may look at. There was reference to that last section being done, an increase in bike ridership. This was something that we asked King County a long time ago when they were first doing the first section. And has King County ever looked at, or can we see if King County's ever looked at increased usage of that trail? While I use that regularly, since I'm day to day, I may be desensitized, but I don't see a massive of any noticeable difference than before we spent all that money on expanding that trail. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mary.
Hello, my name's Mary Wichter, and I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. And I have a PowerPoint tonight. I'm talking on Lewis Thompson Road. It's a consent agenda item on the second one. I don't have any problems with it, but thought we'd reflect on it. It is now $1.32 million. It was originally about $900,000, and it came from a mudslide in 2015. Now, Tamarack has 4 roads that meet Lewis Thompson, and this is the top one. So you can see that's the road there with the roadside ditch, and you can see those culverts right at Lewis Thompson are rather overwhelmed. They have to turn 90 degrees and go down the road. And then that water crosses under the road and it goes into Zakoos Creek. It follows gravity and it does go in. It's actually called the main stem of Zakoos Creek. And that actually wasn't the problem area. The next road down, so that first one I showed you goes where that white mailbox is up at the top. This second one down is 210th Place Southeast. And it's pretty dark there, but you can see the word sewer at the bottom. And I'm going to zoom in there and show you there's the little culvert that clogged. It's kind of an overflow uphill culvert. When the stuff can't make it down, it just got leaves debris in it one morning. And this is what it looks like 3 years later in 2018. And the city had been keeping it clean. I'd been nagging them a little bit, and then they've taken over, and maintenance knows about it now. But basically, water on this road, again, comes from Tamarack to the public road. It has to do a 90-degree turn, and there's also a water valve there, and then it goes to Lewis Thompson. So what happened the day of the fated mudslide was that little teeny roadside culvert clogged, and then it filled up and it flooded the road. And the 911 call was from an area resident. It was not about water flooding across the road. It was about the trees had actually come down. So if you'd not actually had that call, you would have ended up with a way worse situation. Here's the mudslide tarped area that needed repair, and this is actually from a 2018 photograph, which is, like I said, 3 years later, and the stabilization measures that had to be installed in the meantime. It's on a very, very steep slope that goes into Zakoos Creek, which is our key salmon recovery stream for the Kokanee. So these slide photos, I just wanted to show them tonight. The capital improvement project to fix this area and stabilize it was put forth July 10th of 2018. And then you can also see on the right edge of there, there's like an asphalt berm that runs along the road. That was added so that if there was any water that did come off the road, it would go down farther. And they had to actually change that a few times so that didn't dump into Zakoos lower. So I guess the lesson here is there are roads in Tamarack that are pretty full, the ditches that comes from the cumulative excessive development runoff. It goes to Lewis Thompson Road. You kind of dealt with 2 of them through this project, but you have those areas, and then the next road down has not been dealt with, and it has overflows, which I believe cause public safety problems, and also takes a lot of sediment into Zakoos Creek, and you've just spent a lot of money rechannelizing that. So tonight, just because this was on as a consent agenda, I wanted to review it. I did send in a second PowerPoint, which is actually the PowerPoint I did during the week of that slide, so it's from November 2015, and you should be able to click through that and read that. It's very pictorial and shows you what happened. You actually made the news that night. So, and everybody that I think was in charge to do that's gone, so you can call them scapegoats or whatever, but moving ahead, I think you need to deal with stormwater issues earlier than later. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Kevin Jones.
Good evening, Kevin Jones, Transpo Group. One of the items on tonight's agenda is a discussion regarding the city's draft Transportation Improvement Plan, or TIP. It includes 2 improvement projects that together would resolve the concurrency failure for the Sahalee Way 228th Avenue North corridor. These projects would improve the corridor by adding a 3rd lane or center median, right turn lanes, bike lanes, curb, gutter, sidewalk on one side of the street, and installing 2 new traffic signals. The estimated cost is over $54 million. I looked at what the capacity created by these improvements would mean as far as the existing concurrency failure on the Sahalee Way 228th Avenue North corridor. I determined the increase in corridor capacity would allow 32 additional northbound vehicles per hour before the corridor VC threshold would be exceeded, causing the corridor to fail concurrency again during the weekday AM peak hour. Only 32 additional vehicles per hour. I've summarized my calculations in this one-page memo, and I brought 12 copies with me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Karen McKnight.
I'm Karen McKnight, 22329 Northeast 28th Street, Sammamish, Washington. If you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there. A quote I learned along the way. I'm urging the City Council to start an economic development plan for our city. Interim City Manager Larry Patterson told me the City of Sammamish doesn't have one. And in his 30 years, he has never seen a city without an economic development plan. We have a huge dragon coming our way, and it's called 1.8 million residents moving to the Seattle metro area by 2050. It will come whether we plan for it or not. We can continue to build our lovely city with the feel we all want to maintain and also provide for the new residents the Growth Management Act is mandating. We will have new resident numbers in 2023, and we can decide now where we will house that population, how we will provide creative transit options and meet our state obligations. I want to be honest. I do not want us to be a turtle hiding under its shell and not be prepared. Our neighboring cities, Redmond and Issaquah, are preparing on a massive scale. Our city, since I moved here in 1980, has been and will continue to be in the path of growth. Housing is part of an economic development plan, and we need to do much more to provide workforce housing for our local workers. Our teachers can't live here and need to live in Carnation or Auburn, cities to which our workers are currently commuting. Those teachers will eventually transfer to work near where they live, and that can create a decline in our wonderful schools that we love. It's also a driver of our property values. Lack of competition in our commercial real estate market is causing businesses to leave Sammamish. We cannot afford that. Right now, almost all of our income is from homeowner property taxes, and that is not sustainable. We have solutions right in front of us that can help our community grow, and it's time for our city council to shift gears and focus on a cohesive vision for our future. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Celia Wu.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Celia Wu, 27292 4th Lane in Timberline. So let me just put this here. Sorry. Okay. I would like to thank the City Council for the tough decisions and votes at the last hearing. Thank you, Mayor Malchow, Deputy Mayor Moran, Councilman Hornish, and Councilman Ross for making the brave decision of standing up to overdevelopment and listening to the concerns of your constituents. Thank you, Councilwoman Stewart and Councilwoman Ritchie, for expressing your convictions and telling us where you stand. Councilman Valderrama, thank you for your service. It is now time to move on. Split votes leave me concerned. I hope that the 3 councilpersons who dissented will accept that the 4 counterparts have the best intentions for this town, its people, and the environment. We citizens who live the issues also have the best intentions for this town. We can't all be wrong. Leading up to the May 24th vote, misinformation about Sahalee and concurrency stoked the fears of residents. People attended thinking this was a road-widening vote that would eat into their properties. Meanwhile, we citizens expressed overwhelming concern about overdevelopment. We citizens know that the only winner, if we had not adopted the current concurrency, would have been the developer, STCA. When I see a councilman write in social media, quote, "What Mickey and Chrissy have done is force Sammamish taxpayers to pay for a $54 million investment into a road that does nothing to improve traffic," end quote, That is false, yet you keep on spreading that. When another councilman claims in social media that, quote, that under this VC approach, 4 to 6 lanes will be needed on Sahali by 2024, end quote, I see that as no more than a scare tactic. I also understand that the developers' impact fees would not have covered the majority of those road improvements financing. I ask that the council directly address these claims tonight and clear it up once and for all. When a councilman continues to write in social media, quote, lucky for you, I have 2.5 years left on my term to be here calling out the ignorance and arrogance of the other side, end quote. I am disappointed and offended. I voted for you. Please stop it. Please come up with solutions and not threats. Stop insulting your constituents. Stop trying to discredit the Sammamish comment, which has played a watchdog function here since 2002, while all other news outlets have abandoned this city. Please protect your constituents from overdevelopment. We citizens are watching and listening. We all want a safe environment, good schools, affordable housing, sidewalks, and a town center. We just want it to make sense. The current town center plan did not make sense. Please accept the results of the vote and go forward together united to do the people's work. I support Mayor Malchow's suggestions of making data-based decisions and thinking outside the box. I support Councilwoman Stewart's advocacy for more transit that makes sense. Please work together. There is so much to do, and let's not get stuck in traffic, pun intended. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address the council this evening?
Kent Treen, 1825 East Lake Sammamish Parkway, Southeast. Just like to, hi, I'm an educator. I'm a teacher, a longtime teacher, actually. I live in the city of Sammamish. I don't work in the city of Sammamish. I think there's a lot of teachers that are exactly like me, right? I don't want to work in the same place that I teach. All right, and there are a lot of educators that belong to the WEA that think exactly like I do. All right, so if I've heard a lot of talk about teachers. Where's the homes for the teachers? Where's the home for the firefighters? Where are the homes for young people, old people? And I'm just, if we are currently, which I believe we are, if Sammamish is currently a bedroom community, which is what we are, it's not affordable for us to live here. I literally cannot live here if I were to pay today's prices for my home. I've been here 9 years. I got lucky. I came in at a time, if you had told me that I would be living on the lake in Sammamish when I left Washington and came back, I'd ask, did I hit the lottery? Okay, I didn't hit the lottery. I just got lucky in a downturn in the economy. I was fortunate, okay? So to say or to speak to this issue that teachers, firefighters need to have a place to live here in Sammamish, I think that's a misnomer. I think that's wrong way of thinking. Yeah, teachers, when teachers, because of what we get paid for what we do and for the amount of time that we do it, we get well paid, by the way, for what we do and for the amount of time that we're doing our work. We would need to live somewhere like Falls City. All right, we need to live outside of where we work because we can't afford to live in a place like Sammamish. I work in Bellevue School District. I can't afford to live in Bellevue School District, okay, but that's where I work, so I live in Sammamish. Surprise, surprise, people, okay? There are people who are traveling from Tacoma, Federal Way, Snohomish, Everett, to work within the school systems that we have here. So that's one of my points. The other point is, I think you guys made maybe a mistake. And I'm not going to get into all the details because I won't have the time to cover that, but you've exempted East Lake Sammamish Parkway from your concurrency. Where do you think development's going to go then? if I don't have to pass concurrency testing, where's the building going to go? It's going to go along East Lake Sammamish Parkway.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address council this evening? Okay, seeing none, I would entertain a motion for approval of the consent calendar.
So moved.
Second?
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay. Melanie, tell us when you want us to actually utilize this. Do you want us to utilize it for consent? It's an easy test run.
I don't think we can use it tonight.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on, but I can tell if you're connected
Okay.
and you're all just kind of dropping off and coming back on and
Okay.
dropping off. So we've
But what
got
about our
another-
iPads? So, that's all right.
We've got another problem here.
Okay, we'll vote the traditional way until we've got it wrapped up. Okay. All those in favor of approval of the consent calendar, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 6-0, the consent calendar is approved. Okay, our next item this evening is a proclamation. We have Gun Violence Awareness Day. This evening, we have Kim Suver and Aaron Sloan, who are here to read the proclamation.
This is the proclamation for the Gun Violence Awareness Day on June 7th, 2019. Whereas in 2016, over 14,000 Americans lost their lives to firearm homicides at a rate of 4.5 deaths per 1,000 people. And whereas Americans are more likely to be killed with guns than people in many other high-income countries. And whereas protecting public safety in the communities they serve in the city of Sammamish is Sammamish's highest responsibility. And whereas support for the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens goes hand in hand with keeping guns away from people with dangerous histories. And whereas elected officials and law enforcement officers know their communities best, are the most familiar with local criminal activity and how to address it, and are best positioned to understand how to keep their citizens safe. And whereas to honor Hadia and many Americans whose lives were cut short, and the countless survivors who are injured by shootings every day, a national coalition of organizations has designated June 7th, 2019, the first Friday in June, as the 5th National Gun Violence Awareness Day. And whereas the idea was inspired by a group of Hadia's friends who asked their classmates to commemorate her life by wearing orange. They chose this color because hunters wear orange to announce themselves to other hunters when they are out in the woods. And orange is the color that symbolizes the value of human life. And whereas anyone can join this campaign by pledging to wear orange on June 7th, the first Friday in June 2019, to help raise awareness about gun violence. And whereas by wearing orange on June 7th, 2019, Americans will raise awareness about gun violence and honor the lives of gun violence victims and survivors. Whereas we renew our commitment to reduce gun violence and pledge to do all we can to keep firearms out of the hands of those with a history or propensity for violence and encourage responsible gun ownership to help keep our children safe. Now, therefore, be it resolved that Mayor Christy Malchow, on behalf of the Sammamish City Council, declare the first Friday in June 7th, 2019, to be Gun Violence Awareness Day. I encourage all citizens to support their local community's efforts to prevent the tragic effects. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor Malchow and ladies and gentlemen of the Sammamish City Council. My name is Erin Sloan, and this is Kim Suver. Kim and I are moms, Sammamish residents, and volunteer leaders for the Issaquah, Sammamish, Snoqualmie Valley Moms Demand Action local group. Our reason being here weighs heavy on the hearts and minds of many Americans, especially those who serve our communities, because just 4 days ago, another tragedy struck in Virginia Beach. 12 people were killed with a gun, and 4 more were injured. It was our country's 150th mass shooting in 2019. Moms Demand Action is a volunteer organization. We are moms, dads, grandparents, and community members united to prevent gun deaths in our community. Some of us are gun owners, some of us are not. Some of us have experienced gun violence personally. Every single one of us wants to keep our families safe. We support the Second Amendment and believe that common sense measures can be implemented without infringing on constitutional rights. We educate parents on simple steps they can take to reduce the risks of unintentional shootings and teen suicide. We advocate for legislation that makes our community safer, and we support survivors of gun violence. We thank the City of Sammamish, our mayor, and all who serve on the City Council for your proclamation making June 7th, 2019, Gun Violence Awareness Day in the City of Sammamish. National Gun Violence Awareness Day and Wear Orange campaign is a nationwide movement to honor the 100 lives cut short and the hundreds more injured by guns across our nation every day. This Friday, June 7th, is the 5th National Gun Violence Awareness Day. Thank you for recognizing it as an important day for our community. We invite you to wear orange personally to recognize the day, and we brought every member of the council orange ribbons. We also invite you to a very special event happening on Sunday, June 9th at Sam Smith Park in Seattle at 10 a.m. We hope you can join us. Thank you for your commitment to the safety of our community.
Thank you to you both. Aaron, I think we had a request for that date again, date and time.
7.
On Sunday, June 9th, and we're passing it out.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.
She said 7.
June 7th is Wear Orange. June 9th is the event.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so our next item, we have a resolution. This is supporting the countywide ballot proposition for funding the Medic One Emergency Medical Services, or EMS, levy from the period of June 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2025. Mr. City Manager. You want to turn it directly over to our esteemed Eastside Fire and Rescue Chief, Jeff Clark.
All right. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council, Mr. Manager. Appreciate the time tonight. I just want to provide you a quick overview, and then I'll be available for any questions that you might have. I know it's a pretty lengthy packet for this agenda item. As a reminder, since the 1970s, the King County EMS division has been passing levies every 6 years to support the King County EMS department, which includes primarily from a staffing standpoint, the ALS response, or Advanced Life Support Response. For the last 2 years, there has been a planning session to prepare for the levy that's in front of you, the resolution to support the levy that's in front of you. During that planning session, I've been at, either me or a member of my staff have been at every meeting. Councilmember Hornish took part for the first portion of the meetings, and then Vice Mayor Moran took over for the bulk of the meetings towards the end. From that meeting was a strategic planning process, which you have in your packet, which identified the regional-wide, so King County-wide goals for this. Now, as a history in Sammamish, you have never been asked to vote or required to vote in support of this resolution, because before now, you have not had a population of over 50,000 people. Up until the last levy period, there were only about 7 cities that had a population of 50,000 or more. Now there's 11. Also recently, some legislation changed. It used to require 100% support of the cities with 50,000 people. Now it only requires 75% of those cities. So that means 8 would have to support this resolution moving forward in order for the King County Council to put it on the ballot. And their intention is to put it on the ballot in November, from what I understand. The ALS system is vitally important to our response and supporting us, but it's not the entire system. The entire system starts with bystander CPR, bystander awareness, then the dispatch center, which is NORCOM, which you invest in through Eastside, where we have very well-trained dispatchers, and then the BLS response system, which is what Eastside is responsible for not only Sammamish, but the rest of the E4 service area. And then, of course, the ALS response. When you look through that document, and I fielded some questions this morning about response time, keep in mind that the ALS response times are just that, how long it takes the ALS unit from the time they're notified to arrive on scene. It is EFR who is getting there first, and oftentimes, especially on critical calls, long before we're there, it's a bystander talking to the dispatcher at NORCOM, being coached through what we can do in order to support the individual that is down. The hallmark of the King County EMS system outcome data is that of cardiac save rates. The King County save rate for county-wide is about 56%, and this is off of 2017 data, which is the latest available. I forgot my number. It's either 56 or 54. I think it's 56%. I'll dig it up here for you afterwards. And then, but for the east side service area, our save rate is actually 64.5%. And for the last several years, we have trended much higher than what the King County rate is. That is attributable to the bystander awareness that we have, the NORCOM dispatch system, the BLS response system that you support, and of course the ALS response system from there. The other issue surrounding Sammamish specifically has to do with the notion that Sammamish may not be as covered as thoroughly as other areas within King County. There is a limited amount of resources to cover any response area, as you are aware. And last year, the King County EMS Division supported a 6-month temporary unit during some construction that we had here, and we housed that in one of the Sammamish stations, 12 hours a day. They'll continue to do that if we have issues that come up in the future, as long as we go through the process to apply for it. We had asked that another unit, through this process, both myself, Councilmember Hornish, Vice Mayor Moran, have asked and inquired and advocated for more response resources within Sammamish. As this unfolds, as the levy unfolds, the commitment through the levy is that they have set aside dollars for the potential of adding another unit sometime in the 6-year period. Currently, right now, system-wide, the call volume just does not warrant it. And being prudent with the dollars and the budget that's allowed, it's not warranted to add a unit at this time. However, if a unit is added, there's a detailed process that it will go through, and Sammamish will be on the forefront as one of the candidates to receive that. And that's the best that we can do at this point, other than to say, I can tell you, we do not, between myself and my staff, we do not miss a King County EMS meeting. We will be at every meeting. We are representing all of our EFR partners. You are our largest partner, and because you're a city over 50,000, you are the most influential of that group, and we are there in your name, and we will be there, and I'll continue to work with the city manager to advise. So I'm here hoping that you're going to support this resolution. You have been involved in this resolution. We support it wholeheartedly at EFR, and as far as the King County EMS system goes, the hallmark of our region is this EMS system, and in order to continue that, we need support for this levy. And I'd appreciate and we'll be more than willing to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Chief. I think we might have a few. Yeah, Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, Chief, thank you for that report and that candid report, since you put down some of the factors that have been going on. Obviously, it's been a concern to us that we joined, and then the watering down of the votes to the 75% that you had talked to. And having the potential for the ALS is obviously is advantageous, but the concern had been raised ever since that task force with council members Keller, Odell, and myself that we wanted one here. We had them down at station 83.
Correct.
Where we had that unit, and the hope was that that would be a stronger case. Do you feel, what is your feeling as to what potential means? What do you think the probability is in your gut feel?
Yeah, through the mayor, Councilmember Valderrama. Just to be as candid as I can be, like I like to be, when you look at the indicators for growth that King County EMS throughout this entire study has cited, they have cited future population growth and the trends that the King County census drives. That points towards the eastern side.
Absolutely.
And it points towards north side of Sammamish, Redmond, the Novelty Hill area, et cetera, in that area. When you look at the fire department resources, meaning the station locations that are available in those areas, it's hard to imagine growth that does not include a unit in Sammamish Station 82. That is my opinion, and that is just a singular opinion. But looking at the data, I feel assured that if we get to the point where we're going to add a unit in the system, that it will be between this general area, the north part of Sammamish, eastern part of Redmond, versus an area down south, which I'm not near as familiar with, just because they have a higher call volume down there, but they're pretty well covered from this standpoint. And there was something I read earlier today that I do want to state. I should have stated in my intro. Sammamish is the only city over 50,000 that does not actually have a unit placed within Sammamish. Now, you have two actually right on your border. But I do think that when it comes to adding another unit, that is a consideration that will be taken into effect as well.
Thank you. You're a singular chief, so we appreciate that. The other question that I have was one of at least my personal interests would be able to see in the future if Eastside Fire and Rescue could have that ALS capabilities as part of EFR in the long-term function. Having that eventually put in the ALS station at one of our stations here in Sammamish, I assume would facilitate that process of evolution if it were to go forward.
Councilmember Valderrama, you're correct. From a fire service standpoint nationwide, it's a natural progression for firefighters to have the opportunity to expand into paramedicine. That does not exist for Eastside firefighters right now. What you are talking about, though, in order to bridge from the system we have now to get there, is more of a political issue than it is a operational issue. And that's something that would take continued relationship building, continued working within the system as a whole to grow that system. We're certainly capable. And the system is aware of that. But I do think long-term that's the relationship building and the political influence that would gradually drive us in that direction.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I don't have any more lights on, but Chief, thank you for giving us that explanation, and also thank you for championing, bringing ALS here at some point in the future. Hopefully it will be within that 6 years. But I want to go back to what you said about kind of that hierarchy of care where it starts with bystanders and moves to NORCOM. And I had the unfortunate and fortunate blessing and curse of watching that transpire before my eyes. It was horrifying. And it just happened on Memorial Day weekend. And it was a bystander that saved a 5-year-old boy who was pulled out of a pool here in Sammamish. And that response from the bystander saved that boy's life. And everybody on that deck ran and did what they were, including NORCOM and Eastside Fire and Rescue there. Our Sammamish Police Department was there. It was the best possible outcome. But I want to hammer home on that bystander thing because it really does help facilitate if you're witnessing something to be able to jump into action right there. If you haven't taken a CPR or first aid class, I'm pretty sure that Eastside Fire and Rescue hosts them on occasion, and it might be an opportune time to go and get CPR certified so that you can be that bystander and literally save someone's life. So thank you. I'm in full support of supporting this levy. I think we've got to have the services remain for taxpayers. There is no change, I don't think, it's a replacement of an existing levy, so we're not layering on top, and I think that's an important note for taxpayers to understand.
And the actual rate comes down from 33 down to 26.5.
So you're actually getting a savings.
Yeah, in the rate.
Yes, yes. Okay, we've got a few more comments now. Councilmember Hornish.
Before I move to adopt, are we in a position that we can adopt this resolution tonight?
I don't know, why not?
To adopt the resolution to support the countywide ballot proposition for funding the Medic One Emerging Medical Services levy for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2025.
Second.
Okay, we've got our city attorney who's waving in at the end there.
I just want to be heard, Your Honor. This is a bit of a hybrid ballot measure. You'll recall that there's a statute that allows you to take a position for or against a ballot measure as long as you ask or provide substantially equal time for the opponents. We don't really have the ballot measure ready to go yet at King County. This is really encouraging King County to put on the ballot, but to be safe, I think you should ask if there are opposing viewpoints in the audience and give them a chance to speak as well.
Very good. If there is anyone in the audience this evening that has an opposing position on the resolution that council has before it to support the EMS levy, feel free to step forward to the podium. Okay, seeing none. All right, we have a motion on the floor. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion?
Not for me.
Okay, seeing none. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 6-0, we are supporting the resolution. Thank you very much, Chief. Okay, next we have a unfinished business, we are going to have a discussion on the draft 2020 to 2025 Transportation Improvement Plan. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. I'm still getting used to these buttons. Yes, we do have that tonight, and staff is prepared and ready to go. So I'll turn it over to Cheryl and Andrew, and they'll take it from here.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, Mr. City Manager. I apologize, I forgot to actually grab the tip itself. I have a little PowerPoint. In front of you, you should have the updated 6-year tip with a bunch of yellow on it, which shows the changes since the last time that you saw it on May 21st. It also includes the financial analysis at the bottom of the page.
Cheryl, is this different from what's in our packet?
It is a little bit different.
Okay, thank you.
So again, the yellow boxes show what has changed.
Okay.
Thank you for the larger print.
Yes.
Oh, sure. Sorry, just a moment here. And for the audience, we have some copies over here on the staff or on the table over here to my right, if you'd like a copy. Okay. Melanie, would you mind? All right. So unfortunately, I cannot show the tip and the little PowerPoint I have here, but I'll switch over to the tip. I'll walk you through the main changes that we made, and then I'll put the tip up on the screen. So I just have a couple of minutes and a couple of slides here. I'll review the edits to the tip. Please ask any questions that you have, and then the next steps. So the major edits that we made since May 21st, we added the one column there. It says prior years. So we added all those expenditures for all the projects. If you go to item 2, which is Issaquah Pine Lake Road Phase 1, we did change the spending between 2021 and 2022, and then we moved the construction out to 2024 and 2025 instead of 2023 and 2024, and that was per your request again on the 21st. Item 5, Sahali, this is just the Northeast 25th to the city limits project. Again, there are 2 Sahali projects. We added $1.1 million to 2024 to bring the total cost estimate to $11,650,000.
Should those be marked blue concurrency projects?
Oh, I'm sorry, you're correct. Thank you. We'll make that edit. Thanks for the catch. And then item 9, Issaquah Falls City Road Phase. What am I doing here? Oh, we made some, I'm sorry, just a minute here. Item 9. Sorry, I'm flipping back and forth. I was making these slides at the last minute. Item 2. Oh, I'm sorry. Item 2 is Issaquah Pine Lake. Item 9, Issaquah Falls City. So sorry, the letters were throwing me off a little bit. Issaquah Falls City Road Phase 1, we reduced 2020 by $1.4 million and 2021 by $2.5 million, and then increased our 2019 expenditures by $600,000. Again, you'll see those changes in yellow. And then item 14, ITS Phase 2, we had $200,000 that we were going to spend in 2021 and $1.8 million in 2020, and we just moved all the costs into the year 2020. We are going to start that project this year, though.
Cheryl, sorry, which one is that? TR what?
Item 14.
It's TR
and it's TR 19.
Thank you.
the TR numbers are not in chronological order, so I added another column with just the item number to make it easier to reference.
Okay.
And then the next steps is to hold a public hearing and adopt the TIP on June 18th. So let's see. So how do I show mine? How do I show yours? Can I show this? Is there a way? Or can you? Oh, I brought it up online. I just brought it up online. Is there a way to? Oh, you have it online? Yeah.
I know, but Escopana Gross, they're not a concurrency project. TRO2 and TRO3 as well, though? Or just 5 and 6? I'll ask. Cheryl, we're having some discussion over here about which projects on here are not marked as concurrency projects in blue. Is it item 5 and 6? We know.
Yes, it is item 5 and 6.
Just 5 and 6.
Just 5 and 6.
Okay. They are concurrency. The rest, the others that are marked.
Here, we'll do the tip. Let's see. Oh, you do? It should be. I apologize.
I was going to have one of the same thing too. I had the same question.
Apologies to the audience for our technical difficulties here. We'll get there. All right, we have it up.
And I have Chris Giannini here, who is the Deputy Finance Director, to answer any questions about the financial analysis at the bottom of your spreadsheet.
I don't have any lights on yet, but I think everyone's looking at the new sheet with the changes.
Okay.
Okay, we've got a taker. Councilmember Ross.
Thank you. Chris, on the funding, it looks like, if I interpret this correctly, we'll fall $89 million short if we fund everything in this TIP on the 6-year projection, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then if we just looked at concurrency projects, quick math is we're about $9 million short. So if we...
Actually, can you walk us through that? I kind of want to be on the same page.
Okay. So what I'm looking at is the 6-year total is $141 million for all the projects, concurrency and otherwise. And then there's the 6-year revenue generated starts at $30 million in 2020, but with impact fees and real estate excise taxes, the primary revenue sources, it grows to $52 million revenue without charges to it. So comparing the $141 million to $52 million, we fall $89 million short of fully funding the $141 million on the TIP.
Got that. How did you get the concurrency project?
So the concurrency is added up all of the blue identified items, and that adds up to $60.6 million.
Okay, that's what I wanted.
And then there's the 52 million
So you're 8
of revenue leaves you 8 million short if you just compared concurrency projects. Okay? 8 million short. 8.3 million short. So I guess there's obviously, we're going to make choices. We may revise statement of work. We may reduce project costs and some with strategies. We also may increase revenue with strategies. But we do have credit available to us, unused credit, and it exceeds the deficit by a large sum, as I understand it. Not to answer it here yet, but a go back, I'd really like to know how that available credit is utilized. What is the chargeback or the interest rate on it? What is the period of payback on it? And is how much of the payback or the payments monthly or however, whatever the terms are, can we absorb that in our budget? In other words, use our operating budget to pay off the debt. In other words, so I'm trying to see what kind of flex strategies without impacting the taxpayers, looking at our existing line of credit and the payback terms and see if we can fit it into an operating budget, the payback. So if you can help me work or us work through that, that'd be really helpful as a go, because it's an important factor. Before we start saying, let's call on bonds, what can we do within our operations to
So I'm not
try
sure
to
what
be a
you
little more
mean by
creative without
available.
impacting taxpayers?
What do you mean by available credit?
Well, there's a credit, we have the ability to borrow up to a certain sum, and I know it's north of 100 million.
It's way north of 100
Yes,
million.
and it's closer to 200 or something in that range.
Over that.
So if we have that capability, what would, if we, let's be, what if we paid 52 million, the shortage, the 90 million shortage? What if we pulled 90 million out of that credit line? What would be the payback terms? And what kind of operating financial techniques can we use to help pay that back without fully or even impacting taxpayers before we even consider a bond?
Okay, so the way you would access that actually is to issue debt, general obligation bonds.
Okay, and that'd be councilmatic, right?
You could issue councilmatic or you could do voted.
Okay.
So the annual debt service on $20 million would be about $1.4 million at today's interest rates.
That'd be annual or monthly?
Annual. The
Annual.
annual debt service would be
So
$1.4 million.
1.6 million per
1.4 million per $20 million of debt.
Okay. So that'd be about $6 or $7 million for the full deficit if we were to go all the way up to 90 million. Annual payback.
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow your
Well, you said it was
deficit.
for every 20 million you bought our issue, you pay back 1.6 million per year?
1.4 million per year.
1.4, okay, I'm sorry. 1.4, so I'm multiplying that by 4, so 2.8, 5.6, about 6 million then? For a full $80 to $90 million borrowing?
Okay, I'll go with your math.
So, okay, so that's the number. And then, so we have to look, and so, the operating budget, we've been kicking over funding infrastructure about $1 million annually, historically, roughly.
We have been, we did not transfer anything in the 1920 budget.
So we've crossed over, so to speak.
Well, we just haven't transferred anything to the
Just didn't have
capital.
the surplus or the ability to.
We just left it in the general fund.
Okay, okay. So we're building up that as well. Okay.
Deputy, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Councilmember.
so I guess at the, it's not just an isolated focus on, infrastructure or capital funding. It's also, in companion of that, we have to look at the operating fund and how it marries in with bond issuance is what I'm getting at.
Right. We have about $480 million in debt capacity. So you certainly have enough borrowing capacity to issue debt. Paying it back is another question.
So if we don't pay it back with our own operating funds, then we'd have to increase revenue to pay it back to balance the budget, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Deputy Mayor Moran.
Well, one of the first things I want to look at before we start talking about taking out any sort of debt is talking about flexible design standards. And talking about using flexible design standards in particular on Sahali, because I think that would bring down the cost of that project significantly. And I think that would help us a lot on some of the other projects as well. And so, and we don't have any currently. So when I look at one of the questions that, and I can, yesterday, there was a few of us that, or a few of us, 3 of us that met with Todd Levitt, and we came up with a list of a few things that, which I don't have with, I'm sorry, you guys, I left it in my other case, with a few things that we thought were kind of, we wanted to see looked at. Because if we knew what the pavement was that needed to be put down on Sahali, what is it that we have as right-of-way of the city that we already own? Then we could know what the pavement was. Because when I listen to and I read the letter from Transpo, I'm discouraged because this is taking, for example, that we're using a cookie cutter idea of what that roadway is going to be. And that is not the intent of what, in my vision, we have, because it's how it's striped is what's going to give us how many trips are on that road. And there's a whole lot of different striping we can do to get different trips. And I would expect that, we could do a think tank of what that would be. So I would like to know what is the width of that roadway so that we could decide, nobody wants to take land. No land taken from Sahali. What is our current right-of-way? So that we're not taking land, so that amount of money immediately can be taken out of the project. And so then we look at, what we're looking at with design standards. Maybe we don't want a sidewalk on both sides. Maybe we don't need it on both sides. There's a lot of things that I think we could do that would change the price of that roadway. And that might bring us down the amount of money that we need to stay within the budget. Anyway, I'd like your thoughts on that.
Certainly. So a lot of the details would come about when we restart the design again. So we would certainly look at creative ways, every possible way to not take property. And I was just whispering to Andrew, sorry folks, Andrew Zagers is our city engineer, and he said those costs actually don't include any right-of-way. We may have to maybe get a little bit of right-of-way, but the costs that you see there for Sahali do not include any right-of-way costs. And then...
So this is the curb, gutter, sidewalk, median, all that. So this is not just... So this is not just pavement end to pavement end. I'm talking about, because this has got your, this has got sidewalk.
Sidewalk one side.
Okay, sidewalk one side. So tell me, so you've got your sidewalk, you've got your median, right? Okay, so what I'm just saying is there are places where we don't need to have stuff on that roadway. So there's certain areas of that roadway where we don't need to have that sort of stuff on that roadway because there's no place to turn, so we wouldn't need to have it there. And so there's just portions of that design that I think that we could probably alter enough that would probably help us a lot in that cost. And I don't know what we do to allow for flexible design standards. I mean, we don't have it allowed in our code, so I don't know how to allow for that.
So I'll let Andrew speak to the flexible design standards because I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but, no, I forgot what I was gonna say, sorry. Actually, let me have Andrew speak because I just forgot what I was going to say.
Okay.
If I can for 2 seconds, do you mean, you're talking about deviations from our public works standards, I suspect, okay.
Yeah, and that's correct. Exactly, Mayor, what I was going to get into is when we talk about deviating from what our standard roadway section is, in this case, with the concurrency in Sahali, the way these estimates were laid out, were 3 lanes, typically 11-foot lanes, 12-foot median turn, median center lane, curb gutter sidewalks on both sides. That was the basis for these estimates. The existing right-of-way on Sahali, I believe, is around 88 feet, so no right-of-way would be needed to get that roadway section. But however, as Cheryl mentioned, when we get in design, we can look at the practical design, looking at the sections where there is no turning movement, so do you have to have a turn lane? Those were things that we considered when we were last looking at Sahali design, to take those into considerations. There is a process in our public works standards to a deviation where we would have to review and submit essentially submit to ourselves a deviation and have that approved. With the whole concurrency, looking at the numbers, we would be involved and definitely be working with council to provide proposals and then seek for future direction by the council if we wanted to deviate from those standards. So, yeah, and if we were to go to a 5-lane, I think then we would have to look at right-of-way, and we would have to look at probably significant other changes. These estimates, again, are 3 lanes. That meets the current concurrency failure, but if you have to look at a 5-lane section, then these costs are going to go up significantly.
Did you have more?
I think what we talked about yesterday was the fact that what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at strategic ways in moving the traffic on that road with getting as many trips as possible out of that roadway, not just 32 trips out of a cookie cutter approach to it, but getting as many trips as possible, whether you're adding pullouts for buses or whatever, and allowing it so that we can allow more growth and allow for the town center. The whole goal is to allow things to move forward, is to try to fix the problem, not stop something. And so that was the whole idea, was how are we able to utilize that space and stripe it in the best way forward so that we could move forward. And utilize the space without having to go into Sahali and take any land or anything like that.
Let's see, Councilmember Ross, can you pull your button up? Thanks. Okay. Councilmember Valderrama.
So I am supportive of what Councilmember Moran had said, and it's in line with what this council had discussed in March 4th and 5th, that if we take a methodology and it turns out that it was overly expensive, we would revisit the methodology or the level of services on those days. What Councilmember Moran said is very much on point, that we've all reiterated our interest in not taking any land from Sahali. We've all come back and said we want the town center to go forward. So given those 2 points, how can we do this, let's call it strategically, and give real improvements? As we heard today by the transportation engineer Kevin Jones, but also supported by our own Victor Solomon and DEA's Josh Anderson, to put $54 million to get 32 cars through. That means one long plat could take 3 lanes of Sahali at 32 cars each. We need to be looking at a more flexible manner of addressing it. As I recall, there was a plan a couple of years ago that when Council members Hornish, myself, and Malchow were on, that was being looked at specifically at safety on Sahali. I'd like to be able to see if we revisit that plan, that we stopped because we were going to look at the TMP. I don't believe that included sidewalks on both sides. I think we were more strategic and targeted in how we were looking at that. I'd like to be able to see that option that we were going to approve until we delayed it for the TMP as one. Obviously, safety is the first responsibility that we have to our citizens, so I want to make sure that we're covering that. But let's make sure we have real improvements that are being made instead of doing something that has no noticeable difference, as was cited to us previously. I think that's an important thing to look at, and I think that flexibility is important on us. As far as the survey, I'm sure King County has surveyed that road, especially since the road fell off back in the 80s, so I'm sure there are surveys out there that we can then quickly take as the basis to see what flexibility may exist that is either on the right of way or next to it, onto it. Obviously, we want to be careful, because that's where the road will go next time unless we do some tremendous expensive engineering that goes on. So I would be very supportive of seeing that and seeing what changes independent of the VC methodology. If we step back from the VC methodology, what makes sense to put in and do at an expense for our taxpayers to go in. Finally, before we go bonding and taxing our citizens, I think we've got to be able to look at, is there going to be, one, different approaches to the design, two, different analysis to the level of services and methodology as we discussed March 4th and 5th. And the third is, how much is within our purview, the councilmatic bond limit. I don't know, Chris, if did you say the limit we have is 20 million before it has to go to voters?
No. It's a lot more than that. So if you issued 20 million, it would cost 1.4 million in debt.
Yes.
But we have, I don't have the figures with me. I think we've got about 484 million in total bonding capacity. I think a little less than half of that can be done in Councilmatic without a vote. But I can check those numbers for you.
Yeah, now remember when the community center was 30 million, but when it started to be talked about in its first infancy, it was 20. That's when we started to talk about having to go to the voters anyways for it. And though it would be an advisory vote, that would take place. I again remind you that regardless if you go to an advisory or that, we were told by our attorney when it came up that and there was this quote that was given back in January 2003 that our attorney supported at that time, in an era of ever tighter public budgets and voter resistance to tax proposal, the actual occurrence of funding shortfalls for public facility improvement becomes a very realistic scenario. If probable funding for a programmed improvement fails to materialize, whether through failure of grant funding or voter disapproval or otherwise, the responsible jurisdiction must raise additional funds, reassess its land assumptions, or reduce the facility level of services. Thank you.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Thank you. Kind of taking off of what Councilmember Valderrama and Councilmember Moran said. The three of us sat down yesterday, and Councilmember Moran, Deputy Mayor Moran, if you will correct me, please, or Councilmember Valderrama, the three things we talked about for you guys, and I think some of us went to speak to the city manager, were the three basic ideas that came out of this is a cookie cutter approach to that road. And I'm using the term cookie cutter not in a pejorative way, but just trying to think outside the box with limited time, because we do need to plug this in a very limited time. If we're going to put this road on the tip, if we're going to utilize it as a concurrency road or service it as a concurrency failure and look at it, I think what came out of the meeting, or at least my takeaway of the meeting was, I think that there is, and I don't want to speak for everybody, obviously I can't. I think that I've heard from many, many people when doorbelling and on this council that generally speaking, King County dropped a country road on a growing city. And so Holly needs to be upgraded, fixed, serviced, increased safety, maximized, optimized car usage, vehicle usage, multimodal. You could throw a lot out there at it. And I think at least from my impression, what I'm seeing here is let's just get it to pass concurrency. And what I'm hoping we can do, and what I think came out of the meeting was three things. One, has there been a recent survey of the road done such that we can look at, or you can speak to us about what the actual capabilities of the road are, fully built out? Again, not going into, I don't know anybody that's talking about a 5-lane solution anymore. I think it's a question of, if we are talking about working within the existing footprint of the road, what is that footprint? And how wide can it go? What's a proper speed limit? Where are the drainage areas? Where can sidewalks go? What is appropriate? And I'm again not speaking for Deputy Mayor Moran, but I think when she speaks about when I hear the term flexible design standards, that's what I think. I mean, we can talk about, this is how we do it, and here's our city design standards. We apply this to everything. Maybe we should try to be flexible to see what makes sense on this particular road, given its proximity to the golf course and given its proximity to, frankly, a dead end, if you will. The bottom of the hill is we're not there. We don't control the bottom of the hill. So I think there's a couple things there that cause us as a city to be able to pause and think, what other options? So the first thing we came up with was, what are we dealing with? What are the, the survey of it? And if that's available, great. If not, let's get one. And if, again, short time, we've got a couple weeks to deal with this. The second thing is, and again, speaking from my perspective, what we came out of was a real focus on safety. Folks turning out of those neighborhoods, it's a family neighborhoods, lots of kids and blind driveways and blind turns and traffic lights and traffic calming measures. That, to me, is much more important than can we get down the hill Microsoft faster than we did yesterday. Personally, I would like to see us focus on what are the safety components we can do and to move those to the top of the list rather than this wide, this painted lane width and all that. To me, that's more important, speaking for myself, and we talked a little bit about that. But just to include those options, hey, if you plug this little variable in, if we're working with flexible design standards, you're gonna get this bonus or this betterment of safety for the people traveling on the road and living along the road. And the third thing was, and I think what Councilmember Ross was getting at is, I don't know, and I guess, Chris, this is a question for you, is when we talk about, taking out bonded debt, I don't know, this is not my field, I don't know how this works, but I guess my question for you is, don't we need to get a bond rating, or are we not eligible for a bond rating or do we not need a bond rating if we're doing Councilmatic? And how long, that's the first question, do we need one? Do we have to have one?
Normally, the bond rating goes along with the bond issue. There's nothing for the bond rating companies to rate right now because we don't have any outstanding bonds.
Okay, or no debt, well, so
They
they
would
wouldn't
give
be
us
ra-
an
okay.
idea of what the bond rating might be.
Okay, so how would we know what our interest rate would be?
We would find that out when we get into issuing the bonds. How much are you going to issue? What are you going to pay out the bonds with? What's the state of the city's finances? So the interest rate you find out when you get closer to issuing the bonds.
Okay, so just real quickly, and I don't want to hog time, I'm just asking, hypothetically speaking, we say we are going, in the next 10 days, 2 weeks, we come up with, we've got 7 votes, we got a plan. It solves all these problems, we are ready to move, we've got consensus on this plan. It's going to cost $30 million, pick a number, 10, 20, whatever, okay? Less than not the 200 million, the council, we're still within Councilmatic. And we decide we want to do this. How quickly, if we attach bonding to it, if we decided we wanted to move forward on it, how would we know what we're going to wind up paying? I mean, I guess my question at the end of the day is, if we're going to do this, I kind of want to know what our responsibility is within a pretty good estimate, and knowing that we can't know until we actually put the bond out for, review from investors and all that. But is there a way to kind of eyeball it or not?
Probably, but I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
I'm not an expert on bond issues. We'd have to talk with the
So
companies that are experts.
Just to cap this off, those are the 3 things. The third thing was to ask you and to become a relative expert in bond issues in about 2 weeks. I mean, to be able to give us those answers, if at all possible, right? Not in any level of certainty, but what are the kinds of things we could plug in? What's our design area, our survey, and then the bond issue. What are we playing with? Those are the 3 things we came out of the meeting. And I will say it was a great meeting, and we had a lot of, we all got a lot out of it, I think, and it was very helpful. And I hope those are reasonable asks of you guys. And if it's not, tell us, but we thought it would be helpful to us.
How about if in 2 weeks we find an expert who can answer that for you instead of becoming experts?
That's reasonable. Thank you.
Councilmember Hornish.
Okay. I'm going to try to get back to the tip instead of talking about just Sahalee, because we have to have a tip that we need to approve here in 2 weeks, right? It's not about Sahalee, it's not about bonding, but those 2 things go hand in hand in the tip that we have in front of us right here, I think. So I want to kind of go back to the concurrency and the shortfall and just refresh my memory. What's the magic words? The tip has to be approved with funding that's reasonably assured. Is that the magic words or something like that? Okay. So we're a long stone's throw away. Not even a stone's throw. It's a long Hail Mary. So I want to better understand just what's concurrency and what isn't, and just confirm what the costs are with the math that was previously done. So if I could, item 11 and 12 are shown in blue under the projects numbers, TR 51, 52, but they're included in 9 and 10 items 9 and 10, TR7 and TR08. So TR07 and TR08 are not concurrency, but for the roundabouts in TR51 and 52, is that correct?
So the intersections there on Issaquah Falls City are concurrency intersections, and they're failing.
Okay.
And they will be addressed by the Issaquah Falls City Road project. But the roadway, the corridor, it's the only corridors that you have that are failing is Sahalee.
Okay, well, that brings me back, but the intersections on Issaquah Falls City are.
Two.
Could we fix the roundabouts by themselves to repair the concurrency failure?
We could do the roundabouts, however, we still have the issue about the bridge and the dip. That improvement needs to be done to construct the roundabouts because of the road slopes and the approaches. The way that the project is laid out, has the 3 roundabouts. If we just address the 2 roundabouts, we still have to deal with the 247th. Do we widen to the 5 lanes? When we first started the project with proposing 3 roundabouts, the one at 247th at the church, the one at, or 242nd, at the church, 247th, and then Sahalee, we were able to narrow the roadway down to a 4-lane section, part of that practical engineering design. Instead of carrying a 5-lane section, we're able to narrow it down to 4. If we only address 2 of the roundabouts, we still will then have to widen the road wider, 5 lanes, to address the traffic considerations that are out there now. So it's
a little more than I needed.
It's a lot.
I appreciate that.
We can, but it would probably be just as costly.
Okay, so really, in effect, I think what you're saying then is TR07 and TR08 are concurrency projects.
Well, TR07 includes concurrency. It includes 2 concurrency.
But if we're going to fix the concurrency,
yes.
You're telling me we have to do the whole road.
The whole
so
thing,
I'm going to include that, which makes the math then become, instead of being $8 million short, we're $44 million short just for concurrency.
Addressing the projects that have concurrency.
Yes. And you say you can't split it apart. That's why I asked the question. You can't split it apart.
It's a $48 million project.
Yeah. So it is part of concurrency.
I agree.
I think. So just for concurrency, we're now 44 million.
But it's actually not, because if you design the road differently and resolve the intersections.
Back to my question, can you fix the intersections?
It's based on design.
Yeah, I guess I hesitate to add the entire Issaquah Falls City Road, Phase 1 and Phase 2, and say that they're concurrency just because there are concurrency intersections in those roads. Because by extension, then all the other intersections that are failing, you could kind of say, well, the roadway that they are part of, those are concurrency failures.
Well, I'll make a distinction there. I mean, it goes back to my question. The distinction is, can you repair the concurrency failure by repairing the intersection without doing the road? That's a big difference. On these other ones, I think we can just do the intersection to repair the concurrency. Did you understand my distinction anyhow in my head?
I'm sorry.
If it's just an intersection failure and you can repair the intersection, then you don't need to do the whole road if you've repaired the intersection. But my question to Andrew earlier was, can you split this apart? And the answer was no.
The cost could be less. It might not. What's the total? 29.5 and 18.30. 40. Whether it would be 48 million or not, that's what I would hesitate coming to the conclusion that, but for the 2 failing intersections, if to repair the 2 failing intersections, it would be approximately 48 million. And I'm getting that from Issaquah Falls City 1 and 2.
Actually, you know what? I think I misspoke because I'm looking at TR51, TR52. It says it's included in TR07.
Yeah.
Not 08. So my 36 becomes 19.
Plus
the 8 that we're short already. So we're actually 27 short.
29 million.
So not quite as bad, I guess. But where do you get the 48 for the full?
Phase 1 and Phase 2.
Sorry, I was counting Phase 1 and Phase 2. I was sort of tracking along with you, and
Both
so as
I'm looking
I was
at this year, the 6-year total, 19 plus 17?
Look at the total project cost.
Oh, project costs all the way over, because you got prior years and everything else, okay. But I'm looking at cash flow for the next 6 years, not what we've already invested. That $9 million is sunk, right?
Yes.
So I'm looking at how do we meet our cash flow between now and 6 years down the road? And if we have to do the concurrency to allow continued development, then we're actually short by the 19 plus the 8, 27. But we have to do the first, and we wouldn't have to do Phase 2. We could save this at 17. I'm trying to save some money here in the budget, is basically what it comes down to get to some funding that's reasonably assured, but we're still $27 million short just for concurrency. Just so you know, I don't know how we can approve this tip as is to be $90 million short. Stuff has to come off, and stuff has to show reasonably funded for me to vote for a tip, to approve a tip. So we've got to take a lot of these projects off. And I would throw out that the best thing you can do is we've got to start with the concurrency projects, period. And we still got $27 million nut to crack to cover. Now, can we do that by the end of this month and say we reasonably assured that we can get bonding? Maybe. But we need to better understand that to know if we really have the reasonably assuredness of funds just to meet our concurrency, because we're $27 million short for 6 years. Do we have a solution for that between now and 2 weeks from now?
As you mentioned, there are a couple of options. Certainly, you could take projects off the list. You could just work on the concurrency, and along with that, issue, I don't know what the process is to issue councilmanic bonds. It is my understanding that a 6-year tip, and this is where you as council members need to be comfortable with, it's my understanding that the 6-year tip, that you do not need to be in the black at the end of 6 years. Again, that is completely up to the council. If that is if that's your desire, then that certainly means, I would imagine, take a lot of projects off of the list.
Can I ask a question of the city attorney? Well, I thought the tip says you adopt it with reasonable assuredness of the funding for the projects on your tip. Is that correct?
Yeah, with the caveat, it's reasonable assurance.
Right, which is something totally different than being in the black per se. Yeah.
So I will say it's entirely common to see these TIPs adopted with notations for funding like grants, loans. The fact that, and I'm not holding you to the precise numbers, Chris, but the fact that the city has somewhere in the range of $200 million in councilmanic bonding authority, if you just put that in the tip, that would probably do it, because that's something you control.
Right.
So I think that would pass. First of all, I've never seen a challenge to a tip. I'm not saying they're not out there, but I've never seen one, and I've certainly never seen a successful challenge.
Okay.
But you've got plenty of councilmanic bonding authority to cover this.
That's fair. That's fair. And I think the question then is that something we want to do as a council? And I think we probably ought to have a little more grasp on that before we approve it, but it doesn't have to say that we're going to go forward with it either at 200 million or whatever. So just some comfort. Yeah. The question, and you actually brought up something else I wanted to ask about, though. In the past, we have put on grants that we kind of expect and hope and pray for. And I don't see anything on there right now except for what we know. Is that correct?
I think we asked.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, that's because
that's fair.
Well, I think we asked for you guys to not put it on.
We've had, right, other councils that have put a lot of wishing numbers in the grants, and then council members that say, no, we don't, unless you actually have them in hand, do not show them.
Okay,
So
but
again, this is up to you, you count, we can add millions on that bottom part of the table.
But we can also cover it by saying we have a 200 million councilmanic loan cash available. Okay. But we can also try to bring it closer to, I mean, I remember, I'm only talking to 27 on concurrency. Maybe, I don't know what our appetite is for funding, and that's a different discussion and then I think, but we know we have the capability and capacity to put on the tip to cover it, to be able to approve the tip. But what we actually accept for debt is a totally different discussion, I think, so.
One other point, if I may, Tom, same topic, but and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but one reason it's useful to have extra projects on the tip and identify, say, grants or loans as possible funding is because that then qualifies those
Fair enough.
projects
Yeah,
for
that's right.
grants.
Yeah,
I believe
okay.
Southeast Fourth was one of those, right?
Yeah.
Where we got the $3 million TIB loan because it was on the tip, not because we otherwise had funding.
That is correct. Yeah, in order to apply for TIB grant applications, the projects do have to be listed on the 6-year tip.
Okay, fair point. Let me ask a different question. If we were not to just cover it by councilmatic loan that's reasonably assured, would Issaquah Pine Lake fail during the 6 years if we were not to do that project, if that was taken off the tip?
No.
What's your best guess, I guess? I mean,
Again, Sahali is your only failure.
but with
Corridor
the continued
failure.
growth, that would then allow continued growth. Do we think Issaquah Pine Lake would then fail within that 6-year period?
No, not within the next 6 years.
It would not.
Our modeling has shown the only failure is Sahali
In the next 6 years?
in the next 6 years.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, well, he asked one of the questions, because I was trying to figure out how you were defining the concurrency projects on here. I want to ask a question then. Are the blue the failures that need to be rectified? Okay, so not necessarily not concurrency projects, because in the past on our tips, we've identified projects based on whether or not they were concurrency projects, not necessarily whether or not there was a failure, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I think that may be adding to a little confusion. I remember they had a bar kind of running along the side that was like, these are your concurrency. That might be helpful to kind of help us envision what our long-term concurrency projects will be, because I admit I was like, well, how come Issaquah Pine Lake Road is not a concurrency project? And I was going to bring up the point about grants. I know that that's something that council specifically asked not to add in here, so it does, in all likelihood, give us some benefit in the future for having additional funds that we're not recognizing here. I think, yes, in the past we've had maybe a slightly heavier pad on that than what we actually realized, but we've done a pretty good job actually recently obtaining grants, so that's great news for our taxpayers. I want to touch on the flexible design standards. I think if that's something we're going to do, my first ask would be, is that something that exists currently in our public works standards? Because if it doesn't, I think we as a body have the ability to change our own public works standards. We did it once before. Well, the three of us were on this council previously. So if there's not the flexibility there, we have the legislative authority to give ourselves that flexibility. So that is something we can do. So one thing I do want to point out, because there's been a lot of discussion specific to Sahali, is that there are several other projects on this tip that look very similar to that project that we're not picking at specifically. So Issaquah Pine Lake Road and Issaquah Falls City Road are both projects that we're doing the exact same treatments that we're doing to Sahali. So, and those projects are big dollars too. I think we just talked about Issaquah Falls City Road is a $48 million project. Issaquah Pine Lake Road is a $45 million project. But I did have one question, just trying to parse out the costs, since Sahali is more expensive. Is it just simply a longer stretch? Is that why the cost is higher than the other two?
So you're asking if Sahali is quite a bit, it is.
Longer, yeah,
It is
because
quite a
we're
bit
kind of going the full length of the entire corridor where we stopped with the 2 lanes down here at Englewood. Okay, so I think it's very much in line with Issaquah Falls City Road and Issaquah Pine Lake Road's projects on our tip. I'm just looking over all my notes. Oh, so the 202 study, Councilmember Stewart and I met last Friday, and I know she emailed about this, and it's something that I had mentioned to her during that meeting as well, which is I want to understand the logistics. If we move that 202 Sahali Way study that I'd asked to be added on here if we move it forward. I understand, Cheryl, you had, in your response, had made mention that you wanted to try and package it all together. So I want to understand what the benefit of doing that versus us going ahead and looking up the upstream effect of at studying that intersection, because that may help inform us. Can you speak to?
Sure. I think you get a much better holistic view if you can look at a corridor area at the same time, instead of looking at one piece of it 2 years in advance and then come and look at the rest of it. So that was my rationale. It is certainly not a fatal flaw to move the 202 study ahead. We may need to, so say that we start the 202 study next year and then not start on Sahali until 2022. We may have to revisit, the SR 202 study a bit just to bring the numbers up to date, because we'll have had more traffic count numbers, with the striping of Sahali. By the way, we just heard that King County did get bids for restriping the lower portion of Sahali in 202, so they are on schedule to do it later this summer. So again, the danger of putting too much time either between the design and construction, say, or in this case, the study of one part of the corridor with the rest of the corridor, you end up kind of redoing some of the work. But again, it's not a fatal flaw.
Okay. I just think it might help to inform us too about, it's what I said when we adopted our concurrency policy. I'm more interested in the driver experience, and if we can, find a treatment down there that improves our driver experience, it allows us to go back and look at our TIP projects and find out if we're making the right choices on any given road. One thing I want to note too, because I know there's been some discussion over email from council, is that this is a planning document. It is not necessarily a tool that prescribes we will spend $54 million or $48 million. It is simply a planning document. There is a lot of discretion available to council when we adopt this. So we're not married to any numbers, nor any of the projects. Case in point would be Issaquah Pine Lake Road that's been on this TIP for 13 years and we still haven't done anything there. The one concern I do have still, and I know you've moved it further to the right, but if it is not a concurrency failure, we have Issaquah Pine Lake Road still overlapping construction-wise with Issaquah Falls City Road. And again, I know we have flexibility, so just because we adopt it this way doesn't make it so. But I do want to ask the question because we have another TIB grant or we have a grant, I'm not sure if it's TIB grant for Issaquah Falls City Road that's been split in two, $3.5 million for phase one, $1.5 million for phase two. They are connected. We have to do both phases in order to realize the full grant. Does it prescribe, though, that we have to do those projects back to back because there are 0 failures on phase two? So is it possible, based on what we see here, that we do phase one, double back, and maybe we do one of the phases of Issaquah Pine Lake Road and then go back, or we have to do them back to back?
We do not have to do them back to back. We do have to obligate and coordinate with the Connecting Washington grant is the one being referenced. They are split into 2 different fiscal seasons. As long as we coordinate with the state on when we want to obligate, we've been doing that for the last 2 years because when we did receive the grant and coordinating with their fiscals, we've already had to move it a couple times.
Okay.
It doesn't tell us that we have to do both projects right back to back. We've done some shifting as we've done the TIP throughout the years of how we coordinate doing an Issaquah Falls City project, Issaquah Pine Lake, whether we jump back and forth or we do one then the other. We just acknowledge that you can't do both at the same time.
Right.
So
that may be something, incidentally, that we go out to the public and ask, because the people down on the south end of the plateau are the ones that are going to be suffering through what amounts to basically being back-to-back projects. And you may want to ask them if they want reprieve on Issaquah Falls City Road to tie up Issaquah Pine Lake Road or to go back. I would be very interested to hear what the people that use those roadways would want us to do. I mean, I know we can, tinker with the TIP another time. It doesn't necessarily have to show it here, but
I
just
think
as an option.
within the next year with the construction contract just getting awarded. We'll know a better idea what the traffic's going to be like during construction throughout the next year.
Okay.
So by this time next year, when we're looking at the tip again, I'm sure we'll have the same discussions on how we're coordinating one project and the other.
Very good. Councilmember Valderrama.
Yes, thank you for those comments. And Mayor Malchow, you had mentioned that this is a planning document, not a commitment document. And I'm glad that you clarified that, because previously there have been statements to the contrary to say that, hey, we have to fund everything that's here. That's not the case. And so I think sometimes there's a discrepancy about that. So I'm glad that you clarified that this is only a planning document that's required to go through. Second, I think one of the issues that we have to look at here is what are the real sources of funds that can augment it. We talked about the grant funding, and that's one of the purposes of putting here is getting that feel from state legislators and their appetite to help support these projects that could move up or down. Second of all, there have been times that projects were on this tip that was approved and submitted that weren't even in our city. We had projects related to Klahani that we put an asterisk and said on the tip, it was there with an asterisk saying, if you get annexed into our city, which did happen, we will consider and put these on our tip. But they were submitted and not even in our city at that time, and there was no funding nor thought of it. So that's some of the past history of gone forward onto it. We've also put asterisks and notations, as was cited here in the past, so that we can be prudent about what's going to be spent. We've delayed projects. You had mentioned some projects that don't make sense to do, and you've just alluded to some projects, whether for scheduling reasons, of geographic reasons, we may want to do that as we go forward. Additionally, a second point, you had talked about Issaquah Pine Lake Road doing the same thing as Holly. I think that goes back to the flexible design standards. We're making a mistake in turning all of these into cookie cutters. That was not originally the purpose of how we're supposed to be looking at our city. In October, Victor Solomon here came through, and in the case of Sahaly, he was saying you can adopt a much higher standard. He threw out 2.0, whether you like that or not at that time is what he threw out, you can watch. But he was saying you can then make your changes that are real improvements and then tighten it up to see what it is when you understand what the real capacity and what's real effects on it. That's also up to us, and that goes back to the March 4th and 5th conversation that we had of bringing this back in line to what we were going to be doing. I think what we have to be very prudent about, and I think and I hope that's what's being done, is what are we going to be looking at for real improvements here? I disagree and say this is all about Sahaly, because taking out that project 20 or 11 and 12, we then are looking at a $60 million project on the tip, of which 55 million is Sahaly. So this is all about Sahaly, and why that's on versus before October is because of those VC numbers. So we need to be looking at the flexibility in that. We need to be able to look at it. I would like from Chris, just assuming we were to borrow $20 million and assuming we had to pay that debt servicing of 1.6 million, how many years of 1% increases is that? Because isn't, as I was trying to recall, 1% increases of property tax brings us, what, 400,000 per biennium?
It's about $280,000 a year.
Per year, that's right, for biennium. So you take that 200,000, you're basically putting 8 years of 1% for each time you do that just to service that debt, to put it into perspective as to what that means when you say 1.6 million. And don't forget that we have all the other taxes that we're going to be collecting in the background. So just to put that into perspective of what would be put on our citizens. So I'm all for supporting real improvements that'll make real changes. And I think what our city manager eloquently, though subtly, said, then 54 million, now 55.62 million is a lot of money, and we can use that on real improvements around our city. Thank you.
Well, to say that it's all about Sahaly, it might be, or you could look at it from the way I'm looking at it and look that look at the price of what the entire package is, and such a small portion of it is Sahali compared to the entire package, and that's the only thing failing. So I guess I look at the same topic, but I'm looking at it from a different angle. So to me, and I also look at our transportation improvement plan, our TIP, I look at it differently because I look at it as a planning document. I look at it as our TMP. As other cities use their TIP as their TMP, I look at ours. We always have. I see no reason why we shouldn't. It's a planning document. We've always used it that way. The only piece that's missing would be the multimodal. I don't see a problem with continuing. And so I don't see a problem with having using it that way and knowing that it's how it's used. But to point out that, you know, I guess you and I we look at Sahali, but I'm looking at it at a completely different angle than what you're looking at it.
Councilmember Hornish.
Yeah, we're pushing up on our time here. I am in support of moving the 202 study. I realize we may be using a little bit more money, but I think that could really impact this flexible design of Sahali sooner rather than later. So I would, for me, as one vote, move it over to next year.
Yeah.
Just tomorrow. And we're going to hear more about that here soon, I know. So the second point I wanted to make is, if I could ask, before I can get comfortable with really knowing if we're reasonably assured, I'd like to get a better feel for what we can really afford and get a kind of a primer on bonding and loans, and can we pay it out of some of our general funds? Do we have excess that we can use? How much it would cost on a per household basis and that type of thing on a percentage basis. And we've, to try to limit the scope of that presentation, let's not go crazy and go over the 200. Let's just stick with Councilmatic and limit it to that. Don't even worry about going out to the voters and using that scenario. Because I think if truly the Councilmatic is 200, that's more than enough even for all these projects. But I need to better understand that, because I'm not sure I want to go 200 million is my point.
I'm not going there.
Okay. Okay, you done? Okay. Deputy Mayor Moran.
I also wanted to throw another idea out there for future funding on roads, and this is not going to be a popular idea for many, but it is an idea. One of the things that that we've done in the past, and we did it for a very good reason, but it is the REIT tax. And the REIT tax was to fund parkland. And right now we've got a lot of parks. And that was before we were given all of the parkland that has been donated to the city. And that is a huge amount of parkland that has been donated to the city by Mary Piggott. And so I'd like to readdress the fact that everybody always approves money for parks. But it's really hard to go out there and get money for roads, because that's just not pretty. So I'd like to go back and readdress the allocation of where the REIT tax goes. I think a portion of that should stay with parks, but I think that that allocation of where that REIT tax is going, I think that that percentages needs to be changed, because when it was put there was way before we knew that we were going to be getting the huge amount of parks that we did get as a donation. And I know that's not going to be very popular, but
So maybe that's something that you could bring back, kind of the breakdown of REIT and what we can and can't do, just so the deputy mayor has that. Is that something you can do, Chris?
Oh, yeah, REIT is about $3 million a year each to parks and transportation. And you could use all the REIT for transportation if you want to.
To be discussed.
Don't tell Angie I said that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I don't have any more lights on, so hopefully you feel like you have enough from council for the next time we touch this.
City manager understand what we're asking from the city staff? Thank you.
Yes, Counselor. I've been writing it down. I got the notes from the meeting that you had. I also writing down notes here and working with staff. I also have a little bit of knowledge on bonding. before I came here, we were looking at taking out a $60 million bond for transportation issues. And so we got a bunch of information, years, interest. We had no debt, so we did not have a bond rating. So basically, interest was a little higher because of that. And then once you receive your bond rating, it opens more options. So, and of course, getting a good single audit also helps with that, and it helps with grants. So I just went through this process before I left. So I'll work with staff and we get some things and bring it back as a presentation to board with options and kind of what we're looking at. And understand again, the TIP is a planning document. It's not tied to the budget. It's not tied to anything. So, and I would highly recommend we don't take anything off of it. We keep what we want on it. And then every year as we go forward, things are going to change. So, you know, maybe something will change. We want to add or change or put the priority different. So I think we're on the right path. And it was good discussion, and we'll bring some of that back. So thank you.
So just to follow up on your comments. So maybe slow rolling bonds might be better than taking it all early or out at once. So maybe try to incrementally fund over the years.
Yeah,
that would
yes.
improve your rate over time because you are successful on the first issuance,
right,
and then you get a better rate progressively. So might want to see strategically how that works and from a cash flow and a bond issuance standpoint.
Sure, and we can get in. I mean, we called somebody and got an expert to come down as well and talked about that. And mostly we were going for GO bonds. However, interest rates dictate a lot what we're going to do. And then applying debt service, where I was at in that particular state, if you're using state loans, so basically it's a finance authority. We can get low interest loans. They want to intercept monies. So they want to make sure that any kind of revenues you get, whatever that is, they're tied into that, so they're guaranteed their debt is paid. Yes, security, and you're not. So they don't want you to basically budget for debt service. They want to make sure that debt service is going to be paid. So what we have to find out is, can we use our funds to do that? Which I haven't really seen that. I've seen where you have to have a funding source allowed for it, and then but I don't know how that works in this particular state, but we'll get that information. We will bring it back to the council.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Does council want to take a break for a few minutes? Okay, very good. Okay, our next order of business, we have some draft code amendments for the traffic impact fee update project. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. I'll turn it over to Stephanie and her guests. So thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Mayor, City Council, and Mr. City Manager. I'm joined tonight by FCS Group, our consultant for the traffic impact fee update. To my left, I have Doug Gabbard, FCS Group Project Manager, and to my right, John Ghilarducci, FCS Group President. So today, like I said, we're here to talk about the traffic impact fee update. And the goal of this update will be to incorporate the 2020 to 2025 Transportation Improvement Plan into our impact fee calculation and to update the city code. And doing so will provide the city maximum flexibility while remaining consistent with state law. So the outline for tonight's presentation includes a review of our project to date, as well as a summary of those draft code amendments. Those changes will include a summary of updating the definition of development activity, removing exemptions that are not required by state statute, addressing impact fee credits when those credits exceed the amount of impact fee due, and enabling administrative indexing. So first, the traffic impact fee update primarily focuses on updating the traffic impact fee, the code associated with it, and that includes the administrative indexing. And in addition to looking at the traffic impact fee update, we are also including parks impact fee indexing, as well as the surface water development charge indexing. So in the following slides, I will go through each of the proposed code amendments, and I will summarize those changes. If you have questions as we go through them, please let me know. The specific redlined code changes are in your packet material, but we also have additional slides that we can navigate to, so we can look at that on the screen if that would be helpful in your discussion. So let's go dig in. The first update is a definition in the traffic impact fee code, which will look at, we propose updating the definition for development activity. The reason for this is that the state law was recently updated to include, or to revise the definition to exclude homeless shelters and shelters for victims of domestic violence from impact fees. And doing so does not require payment from non-impact fee sources. They are purely exempt. So any input on that? Okay, we'll move on. The next proposed change is regarding exemptions for the traffic impact fee. We are proposing to remove the exemption for development activity taken by the city, public schools, and accessory dwelling units. So the city is allowed to grant certain exemptions within the bounds of state law. However, these activities are not exempted by impact fees like the prior definition we just talked about for the homeless shelters and shelters for victims of domestic violence. So the impact fees are required to be paid back by non-impact fee sources. Our current code does include exemptions for these land uses. So our recommendation is to remove those exemptions. I will add that we received input this evening from Lake Washington and Issaquah Public School Districts. They provided input that they would like to keep the exemption. I would include or add, however, that the cities of Issaquah, Kirkland, and Redmond do not exempt schools currently. So it's really a policy decision that you have the authority to make, whether you choose to keep the exemption and clarify that we have to pay it back from non-impact fee sources, or no longer exempt them, and then the schools would need to pay that fee.
Excuse me, it's Issaquah, Kirkland, and another one?
Redmond.
These are Issaquah, Kirkland, and Redmond.
Thank you.
Do not exempt public
Not
schools.
exempt. Okay.
And just to be clear about the traffic impact fee exemption and removing the exemption for development activity by the city, road projects do not generate traffic demand, so they would not be assessed impact fees. However, city projects that do generate traffic would be assessed impact fees, and essentially would have to transfer money from a non-impact fee source to the impact fee account. So we are looking for your opinion on removing those exemptions.
Councilmember Hornish.
What do surrounding cities do on ADUs?
So we do have a table. I can see if I can navigate to that, showing comparisons for ADUs. Let's see.
Issaquah, Kirkland, and Redmond all exempt accessory dwelling.
Do they?
Sorry, can you read? Can you speak that again in a microphone?
Yeah. Got to get cozy up there.
From what we could tell, according to the research we did for this program comparison table in the very back of the packet here, Issaquah, Kirkland, and Redmond are among those which do exempt accessory dwelling units. Sammamish currently does, as Stephanie mentioned.
Yeah, so, right. So I'm a little reluctant to have the ADUs removed, I guess, is kind of where I'm going.
A little bit, if I may.
Please.
What the statute provides is that you can provide these exemptions for broad public purposes. You just need to backfill the revenue, as Stephanie was describing, from non-impact fee sources. So you can exempt them, but you have to essentially make sure those impact fees are paid by another,
somebody else.
by another source. Exactly.
Yeah.
A non-impact fee source.
Okay.
So, but to grant those exemptions is entirely a policy call.
And I think the idea is to have low-cost additional dwelling units kind of would make sense from a policy point of view, at least from my point of view. So something to consider.
I have a quick question as on the same line. Is it possible that there's some kind of tiering for the impact fee, so they're not having to pay a full impact fee? The only reason I ask is an ADU may or may not have an impact. I mean, unlikely to have an impact on schools, likely to have an impact potentially on our roads and potentially our parks as well. So is there a way, I certainly understand where Councilmember Hornish is coming from, and we certainly may consider exempting them, but I'm just curious if there's a way that they're not having to pay the full impact fee.
Mayor, when you say they, are you referring to
ADUs, sorry.
ADUs?
Yes, sorry.
So yes, and this gets into some of the artistry of an impact fee, because one of the things that you're allowed in statute is if a development activity does not create additional demand, then you don't have to charge for it. So that's not the same thing as these policy-based exemptions we're talking about. That's a cost-based finding that these facilities do not create additional demand on our transportation facilities. So the artistry with an ADU is, at the far end, there could be a finding that in our community, ADUs do not contribute to additional traffic. And if that is your straight-faced finding, then that would be grounds for not charging an impact fee, a completely cost-based, justifiable way. You may also find that ADUs do contribute to traffic, but at certainly a lesser rate than other residential land uses. You could call a single family with an ADU, for example, a single family, and the ADU is a multifamily unit. So you could charge it like an apartment. Or you could get even fancier if you want, and you could say that the combination of an ADU and a single family is like a duplex, and netting out the single family, and now you have an impact fee that's even smaller than a multifamily unit. So this has, I don't want to, this is a technical issue, not a policy issue, but there are degrees of freedom in the technical issue of the finding of how the impact is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, but I think in the scenario you just gave, you're running on the assumption that the single-family house is being constructed at the exact same time that the ADU is?
No, ma'am.
No, okay, because the single-family house has already paid their
Yes,
impact fees.
absolutely.
They're done.
Absolutely.
So then you're treating the ADU as if now it was part of a duplex? Is that what you were suggesting?
So it could easily be calculated that way.
Okay.
So if someone were building an ADU, I would calculate the impact fee as if a new duplex was being built.
Gotcha.
And then net out a single-family residence
Okay.
from that.
Got it. Councilmember Hornish?
So to the point about it being having to be made up with other funds, if you do it your way, would you still have to make it up, or is that saying there is no impact? It's different. Okay,
No,
that's why
you are charging proportion to the impact, which is always appropriate.
Got it. So how do we go about moving forward on something along those paths? With using your artistry.
For ADUs.
Yes.
That's easy. We put it in your impact fee schedule at the level of trips that we think is right in this community.
With some reasonable basis, but
Yes,
okay, but
absolutely.
you can bring that back to us. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd
Absolutely.
like to see that. That'd
Okay.
be great. Okay.
Councilmember Valderrama?
Just following the line, and I'm fully supportive of the artistry. And what was the Harry Potter, the art, the master of wizardry on that? But when we're talking about the new numbers, would it be based similar, and this just as an apartment? Would that be the way that we'd be doing it for the cars, the generations, and the impact fees dissociated under your duplex idea, or was you're netting out the single family? So I'm just curious in that art of wizardry, what that will be when it comes back to us.
So under that particular trick, what you would have is an impact fee for the ADU that would be less than for an apartment, because duplex minus single family is less than an apartment. What I've also, what I haven't even brought up yet is I've seen in some jurisdictions, the use of seniors housing.
Well,
There are a
that's
couple
where I
of-
was going to go, because people call it the grandparents' cottage,
Yep.
and so the numbers of vehicle commutes are much less.
That's exactly
Thank
right.
God, in the case of my parents, you don't want them on the road. So,
So in the new ITE manual, that's the Institute of Transportation Engineers, they put out this Bible of data. There are new seniors housing land use categories that we could take advantage of for this purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on. Next is credits for traffic impact fees. So City Code does already address impact fee credits consistent with state law. And state law does require, that's the asterisk on the bottom, that state law requires the city to provide a credit for the value of any dedication of land for improvement to or new construction of any system improvements provided by a developer that are required as a condition of approval. And where state law does not specifically address how to provide credit is when that credit exceeds the amount of the impact fee that would otherwise be assessed. So an example would be a project builds a new intersection along a roadway, and that project is included on our transportation improvement plan. The developer is eligible to receive credit for that, and the credit's calculated based on the project value. And in order to address this in our code, we would recommend including a provision for those instances to give credit for the value that exceeds the impact fee by allowing them to use it on subsequent phases of the same development. Note, however, though, for projects where there are no subsequent phases, there would be no use for that credit. No input on?
No questions.
Okay. Next, we get into the indexing provisions. For the first one, it's traffic impact fee. And our code in this section provides council the authority to adjust the impact fee however you see fit, and that will not go away. In those years where council chooses not to take any action, this change would allow the director to administratively adjust the fee according to these provisions. And our code currently includes a provision to index the fee administratively. However, because those rates are specifically in the code, by its nature, you cannot adjust it administratively because it requires your action. So that's the issue. That's one of the issues. The other is that the index we currently specify is the Washington State Department of Transportation Construction Cost Index, which was discontinued in 2016. So we recommend updating the index to use the Engineering News Records Construction Cost Index for Seattle, and then reference the fee schedule for those impact fee rates as opposed to having them directly in the code. And we would also specify and include that when the index is negative, the fee would not be adjusted. There's no input? Okay. Similarly for parks, they also have an indexing provision in the code. However, the rates are listed in the code, so it cannot be done administratively. So we recommend putting those fees in the fee schedule. We also recommend using a weighted average of two different indices. For capital costs minus land acquisition, use the Engineering News Records Construction Cost Index. And then for land acquisition, use the Federal Housing Finance Agency Housing Price Index. And those would be weighted based on the value of land or construction capital costs. That value would be determined, the value for the weights would be determined once and then would be applied to each index annually or whenever the adjustment would need to be made. And then again, when the index is negative, the fee would not be adjusted. Finally, the surface water development charge does not currently have an indexing provision. So we recommend including a provision to allow administrative adjustment using the Engineering News Records Construction Cost Index for Seattle. Again, when the index is negative, the fee would not be adjusted. Lastly, the implementation of impact fee expenditure. This is not a code issue per se, but it's more of a interpretation and application of our policy. So our current practice is to limit the expenditure of impact fees to projects that were on the Transportation Improvement Plan at the time of collection of those fees. So this, we've been advised that this is an overly strict interpretation and that we can use impact fee revenue toward eligible costs of projects on, any project on the current Transportation Improvement Plan.
Shame on us.
So revising our implementation of this would give us the maximum flexibility while still being consistent with state law.
Good.
So the next step for this project really does hinge on the adoption of the 2020 to 2025 Transportation Improvement Plan, which that list of projects does have a large impact on what our traffic impact fee ends up being based on the eligible costs and the projects on that list. And then using that adopted 6-year Transportation Improvement Plan and some of the input you've provided today, we'll finalize these draft code amendments, update the traffic impact fee amount, and come back to you for a public hearing on July 2nd. Are there any other questions?
I think we got them all during the course of the presentation. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Our next item is an introduction to WSDOT's draft SR 202 corridor study.
Change over at the desk. Change over at the desk.
You got younger kids. What is the name of that master, the wizard on Harry Potter? Master? Mega? Cool guy. Yeah, and so there's also the dark art that always turns out to be an evil guy. Yeah, well, Dumbledore. But who's the, remember, there's always, Voldemort always takes the master of dark art, says something he's got to learn to, we're not staying in touch with our kids.
Trying to get mine to go to sleep now. It's late.
That's your impact fee for being on the accounts. There might be. We'll share one. Which one?
Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. This evening, we're pleased to introduce the draft of the State Route 202 corridor study. We've invited our guests from the Washington State Department of Transportation. We have Thomas Noyes. He's the senior transportation planner that helped lead the study, and also Mon Sidhu, the assistant area traffic engineer. And we also have Christina Strand, the King area traffic engineer. They've accepted our invitation to come and share with council about this study. It dropped yesterday. It's 182 pages. Thank you for reading it. And so to help with our review, the comments are due June 14th. And so we thought that this would be a good time to get some perspective, a high-level view of what's in the study, and what the methodology was to arrive at the recommendations for solutions for the corridor. And then having said that, Public Works proposes that we would get council members' comments even earlier, June 12th, so they can be compiled and Sammamish could submit one list of comments back to WashDOT by June 14th. They're then going to deliver this to the state legislature by June 30th. This study had a budget of $200,000. So it necessarily had to have, a scope that was reasonable. It didn't come up with one single silver bullet that solved all the traffic. But instead, it looks at current and future traffic patterns and trends. And I think it develops a picture and identifies potential solutions to the traffic issues. Staff believes that this report represents a significant reference point for future specific, more detailed design studies and also regional partnerships and grant funding opportunities. There'll also be a time for questions after their presentation. So I think now I'll turn it over to Thomas.
Thank you, Jed. There we go. Thank you, Jed. Mayor Malchow, Deputy Mayor Moran, and members of the Sammamish City Council, thank you for having us here tonight. Again, I'm Thomas Noyes, Senior Transportation Planner with Washington State Department of Transportation, here to speak with you all. Let's see, how does this, just arrow? Yes. It's not doing anything. Oh, maybe I'm hitting the wrong arrow. There we go. Sorry. Here to give you a quick briefing on the SR 202 corridor study. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the study, the how, what's, and the whys of it. The funding is, as Jed has just mentioned. The what practical solutions is. We have a practical solutions approach methodology, a little bit on the modeling and the traffic analysis, existing conditions that we did, how we evaluated, screened, and ultimately recommended alternatives. The regional transit and as part of the corridor and here in the Sammamish area and how that plays into the study, recommendations, letting you all know about feedback, and then the next steps for this study. In terms of background, as some of you may recall, back in 2 years ago, the city of Sammamish under Mayor Don Jaron wrote a letter to the legislature in addition to some of the ETP legislative priorities, one of which was to conduct a study of the 202 corridor study, understanding that it's really the main conduit into the city of Sammamish. So the legislature issued a proviso to WashDOT to study the 202 corridor on the east side. It was a very non-specific proviso. It basically just directed us to do this study. It didn't direct specific study limits. It gave us a modest budget, as mentioned, of $200,000. We basically ended up doing the study with in-house resources, namely traffic in our office. And in consultation with our study partners, including the cities of Sammamish, Redmond, and King County, we identified kind of the area being from the East Lake Sammamish Parkway intersection to 244th Avenue Northeast. The study area is approximately slightly under 5 miles in total length. In terms of objectives, we're really trying to understand what the current performance is, where the performance gaps are, understanding a lot of concern about safety, mobility, travel time, and access, both along the 202 corridor itself and access to the Sammamish Plateau, understanding the critical importance of the Sahalee Way connection. Then helping to determine what our future priorities are for both the highway investment needs itself, as well as non-motorized and transit needs along the corridor. The outcome from this study will be a package of cost-effective concepts in both near, mid, and long-term timeframes to help address trip reliability and safety on the 202 corridor itself. Just a little bit of background on practical solutions. Some of you may have heard about this. This is kind of a new approach at the department. In some ways, it's really formalizing what we already do in transportation planning. It's recognition that congestion is a universal factor in a lot of transportation, and there's never enough resources to deal with it, as you all well understand. Roger Millar, our boss, talks about the philosophical concept of we're making the right investment at the right location at the right time. We're trying to recognize we're addressing congestion and other system needs with our limited available resources. We're trying to really be more than just doing project delivery, but being good stewards of the transportation system overall, and that's more than just the highway itself. So there's a multimodal flavor to it. Partnerships and consultation and working with partners is a big part of it as well. So working with local communities is critical and key. And again, focus on keeping the system in state of good repair. Just a little bit of a flavor here for how we applied practical solutions in this study. Again, we started looking at the current roadway performance. Mon will be talking about this in a moment with the traffic analysis. We looked at, again, the highway performance itself, where there's safety, congestion, and travel time gaps and issues. We also looked at the other modes. We looked at transit and active transportation, which is bicycle and pedestrian needs along the corridor. We had a baseline year of 2018, and that's what we collected existing traffic count data for. Again, practical solutions looks at different timeframes, breaking out to short, mid, and long term. So the near term we identified is year 2025, and long term 20 years plus as 2045. As you can see, the partners here, again, Sammamish was a critical partner in this study, as was the city of Redmond. Worked closely with King County Metro, the Parks Division, also the Roads Division, and Sound Transit. We had a stakeholder committee established. We held 4 meetings through the course of the study over the last year. We just had our last meeting last week here at the city of Sammamish, and thanks again to City of Sammamish staff for hosting us most graciously. In terms of the outcomes, we're developing a package of long-term, mid, and short-term improvement options, primarily focusing on intersections. There were 11 intersections identified within our study limits, and Mon will speak to that in a moment. We had in terms of public outreach, because this was a very limited budget, we didn't do any public meetings because those tend to be rather resource intensive, and sometimes the payback on those are not good. What we ended up doing instead was we had a public web survey, an online survey, where the public was given the opportunity to answer a series of questions and also provide some open-ended input as to what their thoughts and the needs were for this corridor study and the corridor itself. And as also mentioned, we had 4 stakeholder committee meetings with our partners. These next 2 slides are just quick sort of snapshot kind of key findings from the web survey that we did. We conducted this online last fall. We worked with the local cities. A lot of this kind of went out through social media. We have a communications team in our region office, and they led this effort. We got an amazing response. We were hoping to maybe get up to maybe 800 survey respondents. We got almost 3,000, 2,929 to be precise. As you can see here, the majority of the respondents were private vehicle users. So there was definitely a large contingent of drivers who responded to the survey, but many of them use the corridor on a daily basis, over 70%. And as you can see here, the first segment and the sections identified for improvement is from 520 to the East Lake Sammamish Parkway intersection, which was technically outside of the study area, but it's definitely an influence and feeder into the 202 corridor itself, which we studied. So that segment going all the way down to 236 was identified by almost 80% of the respondents as really needing the most improvement. In other words, the public really gets that that's the really tough and difficult section of 202 in terms of safety, congestion, delay, queuing at intersections, things of that nature. This next slide, there's kind of 2 key points here in terms of identifying priorities for the study that they thought were important, and then what improvements they wanted to see us address and identify as recommendations in the study. So the top chart there, basically about 60%, excuse me, said they really wanted us to focus on three key items: managing congestion, improving travel reliability, and improving safety. And that's really, in many ways, that's very consistent with the practical solutions approach, looking at where are those needs in those category areas. There was also an interest in improving transit service on the corridor, and there were others who also expressed interest in trying to address pedestrian and bicycle safety, because that's a critical need on the corridor as well. The bottom little chart here shows the improvements they wanted to see the study focus on and recommend as possible outcomes. Not surprisingly, most people, over 75%, said we want more lanes, we want more capacity. There were also a lot of interest in operational strategies and wider shoulders, alternative transportation as well. One of the outliers that we thought was kind of interesting is about 8% of the survey respondents said, why don't you do more roundabouts at intersections, which we thought was kind of interesting because typically, as you may well know, sometimes when you propose doing a new roundabout at an intersection, sometimes the public either doesn't like the idea or they're not necessarily supportive of it. So we thought that was kind of interesting. Lowering speed limits was another area they wanted to focus on. As you get further east from Sahalee Way, as the speed increases, it's perceived to be more dangerous. I've put a little link here to the survey results site if you want to peruse that, and I will forward that to city staff so you can access that. This next slide is on modeling performance analysis, and Mon is going to speak to this.
Thank you, Thomas. So as was mentioned earlier, we focused on 11 intersections in this corridor. The study limits weren't defined with the allocation of the monies from the legislature, so we knew that we wanted to look beyond the Sahali Way intersection and look at the corridor. So we went from East Lake Sammamish Parkway to 244th to the east. And we wanted to make sure to capture those two corridor capacity constraints, the East Lake Sammamish Parkway and Sahali Way. And the tools that we used to model the corridor were SynchroSim Traffic to look at the intersections as they are currently existing, and also look at some of the alternatives at East Lake Sammamish Parkway, and then also used Sidra, which helps us analyze roundabouts. In our review of the corridor, we did do field reviews. We had engineers driving the corridor in both the AM and PM peak periods during those times where we have high volumes, but also where we have that peak congestion. So we took those field observations and used that to inform our analysis and make sure we were capturing that in our existing study.
Thank you, Mon. This next slide here, this is just a quick overview of the evaluation process and analysis, how we sort of, the tools and sort of the framework for doing the performance evaluation. Again, really focused on kind of the practical solutions philosophy to have a sort of fairly rigorous development and screening process, and then identifying performance metrics. The key categories really focused on mobility, safety, and feasibility. And then there was a series of performance metrics we kind of went through a screening process to decide, and in consultation with the study partners, of course, to determine what metrics are really most appropriate to analyze and figure out where the mobility and safety and feasibility performance is currently, where it will be in the future, and where it's falling short. The most detailed sort of technical level of analysis, and Mon will speak to this in a couple of slides, it was under the mobility. Again, here is where you're doing kind of the really quantitative numbers analysis at the intersection level to figure out what is the current level of service to the intersection based on growth in 2025 and 2045. What will the future level of service be at these intersections? Several intersections, of course, again, East Lake Sammamish Parkway and Sahali are ones that have clear performance issues now and going into the future. Travel times across the corridor itself, that's corridor segments that we analyzed, was a big piece of that, as well as queue lengths, which are backups at the individual intersections. Bicycle, pedestrian, and transit components were also important metrics to evaluate with respect to mobility, where you're able to improve level of service and or travel times. That, of course, benefits not only cars and drivers, but also transit. Safety is primarily focused on where are opportunities to improve safeties, reduce crashes, things of that nature. WSDOT has a policy, the Target Zero, which is trying to get us, Vision Zero, to get us to 0 deaths by year 2030. A lot of local cities have their sort of local Target Zero programs as well. So that's kind of the policy level focus on safety. Feasibility primarily boils down to cost. What is the cost of a potential improvement alternative? However, feasibility is not really shown here. It also definitely includes community support. In other words, if there's going to be an alternative that's moved forward, it needs to have not only WSDOT being a champion for that improvement, but it needs local support as well. In other words, we're not going to move forward with an improvement alternative that does not have community support. And again, the performance evaluation framework was for near, mid, and long-term timeframes, as is consistent with practical solutions. This is just, again, further sort of detail on the evaluation process. I won't go through this in real detail, and Mon will speak briefly to the quantitative analysis that was done for several of the intersections. In the matrix, you'll see there's 3 intersection improvement alternatives identified, one for East Lake Sammamish Parkway and 2 for, one for East Lake Sammamish Parkway and 2 for Sahali Way. Those were evaluated in detailed quantitative numerical analysis and technical work. There were a number of other potential improvement strategies, mainly near and midterm, although there were a few long terms that were, due to various data or other challenges and scope limitations, were not able to be quantitatively evaluated in great detail, and those are noted in gray. And then there's a transit and transportation demand management, otherwise known as TDM component, those are noted in green. Those were primarily developed in consultation with Sound Transit and primarily Metro Transit. Scoring range, maybe I'll let Mon speak briefly to the scoring and just kind of the detailed quantitative analysis that was done.
So we looked at scoring from, as Thomas mentioned on the previous slides, at the different categories of mobility, safety, and feasibility. And so the scoring range of 1 to 5 for each of those categories represents whether something performs worse, performs neutrally, or as the current experience, or if it's scored a 5, it performs above average. So when we went through the matrix, and you'll see this in the appendix of the study, when you're seeing scores of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the score of 3 is relative to what the current conditions are for mobility. 5 would be a great improvement in mobility. And as far as cost, when we looked at cost, those items were done in a planning level cost estimate. So those were very preliminary cost estimates. And those don't assume design, funding for design elements. That's just the construction cost. And so that's what informs the feasibility component of it. And then safety, that's just a qualitative assessment of safety. For example, with a roundabout, we would expect an improvement in safety, especially in the fatal and serious crash injury risk. So we would rate that higher than something like, say, adding a right turn pocket, for example.
And I would just sort of emphasize the cost range that you see in the matrix that we've handed out, just to, again, the very important planning disclaimer here that these are very preliminary planning level cost estimates. We have at WashDOT, we have a planning level, what's called a planning level cost estimation tool. And it is kind of a cost estimating tool, but it assumes very little design has been done, and in some cases none at all. So the cost range that's shown here is very preliminary and really is based on no design. So it should be viewed as just a starting point for potential cost estimates, but by no means is it anywhere close to final. So just a very important disclaimer on that. Transit was a big part of this study. Again, both Metro and Sound Transit were key study partners engaged in this study from the beginning. As you well know, these are the routes serving the SR 202 corridor and the State Sammamish Plateau. Not a lot, basically 4 key routes. Looking at benefits to transit was an important part of both the quantitative and qualitative evaluation. I think we got some good ideas and some good input from Metro Transit on what you see in the package there of potential transit and TDM improvement options, most of which are in the near to midterm, but there are a few longer term options potentially, and one of which is looking at kind of long-term corridor-wide performance and where we can provide more benefit for transit. The third bullet from the bottom there is just, again, a compendium of a lot of what Metro's doing right now. They have a number of these different programs, Ride 2, which they're doing at the Eastgate Transit Center, for example, as a pilot. And they're doing one in West Seattle as well, the Mobility Hub, the Community Connects, which is kind of a demand responsive service. These are all, the idea behind these are all the kind of the last mile connections where, instead of people maybe having to drive to a park and ride lot, they can take a shuttle or a van. They can push a thing on their phone, an app, and they can, 10 minutes later, they'll get a van pool trip or a shuttle trip from their home, and maybe it's only a mile or so from the park and ride, rather than one more car trip going to the park and ride. So these are, I think, some good opportunities for the city to maybe work with Metro Transit on going forward in the near term, because there's some good opportunities here, and Metro is very interested in working with the city on this. And again, I would just emphasize that this is really for whatever the city would be interested in considering in pursuing these various transit mobility programs. They should work directly with King County Metro on this. We can recommend these, but we clearly have no control over Metro's program and their budget and their planning processes. So how that all moves forward is kind of something the city will want to work with King County Metro on. As you know, the Sound Transit Park and Ride on Sahalee Way corridor is due to open by 2024, as is the Eastlink station at Marymore. And there's also planning going on for Metro Transit service reroutes as part of that process. This next slide here is the suggested roundabout option for Sahalee Way, which I'll let Mon speak to.
Actually, let's fix this, because this
Yeah.
is, I want everybody to hear this. Hang on, let's hang on a minute.
I'll give you an opportunity to clean up.
We got to clean up 202.
Clean up on aisle 2.
Yeah. I set my box down too. It's the excitement.
Roundabouts were exciting.
A few slides earlier, Thomas had mentioned on the web survey that, what improvements do users wants to see on the corridor, and a lot of the respondents said add more lanes. And but 202 has a lot of constraints already built into it, especially as you're going into Redmond. There's a lot of development up against the 202 corridor. It has sidewalks, curb and gutter, access management. As you get closer to East Lake Sam at that intersection, you've got the big box retail stores, you've got Whole Foods, there's a strip mall on the other side. So the corridor has constraints, and as Jed said earlier, there is no silver bullet to kind of solving the mobility on the 202 corridor. Maybe this option here could be a brass bullet, if you will, and one step to helping address that. Sahalee Way is one of those intersections on the 202 corridor that has that capacity constraint built into it. There's long queues in the morning going northbound on Sahalee Way, waiting to get onto westbound 202 to head towards Redmond. Eastbound, folks coming back, they're piling up in the right lane, longer queues, making that right turn back, going south on Sahalee Way. So one of those strategies that we can look at to help improve mobility at the intersection is a roundabout. And so we looked at 3 roundabout alternatives. And this is B. There was an A, B, and C. A was a smaller roundabout alternative with just a single lane roundabout. That did not work. Option C was a much larger roundabout, so that had 2 full circulating lanes, plus a westbound bypass exclusive for westbound traffic, plus the eastbound right turn bypass to southbound Sahalee Way that you see. So option B here is kind of a combination of the 2. So you've got a hybrid of 1 circulating lane in the southwest corner and then 2 circulating lanes, so to facilitate that north to west movement. So there is a trade-off, though, with the improved mobility, and that's the impact to 202. And so if the roundabout overperforms and really takes a lot of that traffic that's on Sahalee Way and puts it on 202, what's that impact on 202 westbound in the morning? And that's something that
Get closer
wasn't.
to the mic.
I'm sorry.
Repeat about the impacts if you put too much on the performance.
Yeah, so if the roundabout overperforms, it can have a great improvement on mobility. And it can move that queue that exists today on Sahalee Way northbound, and that queue can move on to 202. That's something that this study did not analyze. It didn't look at the impacts of what is the systematic, holistic impact of a roundabout here at Sahalee Way. So what we have illustrated here with these red boxes that look like bricks on each leg of the roundabout, those would be meters. And so when we first started our investigation, we noticed that with this configuration, there was enough eastbound traffic in the morning that it wasn't facilitating the movement of northbound traffic onto 202. So we added a meter on eastbound 202 for that morning peak commute. So the meter the meter in the morning would hold back eastbound traffic and release them slowly. And that would allow greater opportunities for that northbound traffic to enter onto westbound 202. What we didn't have an opportunity to analyze, again, is just with that added traffic from northbound Sahalee Way going to westbound 202, what would that impact be? So we added meters to all the legs of the roundabout to give us that flexibility in the future so that, the meter may not need to be operated on all legs on opening day. But depending on how it performs, we would have that flexibility to hold some traffic back, to continue to allow that mobility to occur on 202 and have that progression westbound.
I have a quick question on that.
Yes.
So you use Sidra to model roundabouts, correct?
Yes.
So did you model what it looks like with the use of the these meters then or the study just didn't quite go that far?
We modeled the eastbound meter.
Okay.
We did not model the northbound or the westbound meter.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Sorry. So this next intersection is the East Lake Sammamish Parkway in Redmond, but we understand, of course, this is obviously of great interest to the city as well. So mine has a little bit of description of kind of the analysis we did here, and this is just merely a photograph of the existing layout of the intersection.
So East Lake Sammamish Parkway, there were a lot of great ideas that came out of our brainstorming session with the stakeholders, with City of Sammamish, with City of Redmond. But with the scope of our study, we were limited to more operational looks at this intersection. What could we improve operationally at this location? And as I mentioned before, we have constraints at this intersection. We've got the retail and then the existing sidewalks and infrastructure surrounding it. So what we came to were two strategies for improving the intersection operation. And one is moving the crosswalk that currently crosses diagonally across the intersection. And the other is adding an additional southbound through lane on 188th East Lake Sammamish Parkway southbound through the intersection. Currently, the north leg southbound, there's just one through lane.
Yep.
So by moving the crosswalk from the center of the intersection and moving that east onto the east leg of the intersection, that could help, because right now when somebody pushes the crosswalk, that
ties up everything.
Exactly. The southbound can't go through, northbound can't go through, east or westbound can't go through. So by moving that crosswalk to the east leg, that would allow the north and southbound movements to go concurrently with the pedestrian movement. By adding a southbound through lane, that would add additional capacity for that southbound signal phase. And there's a potential there if you are processing more traffic through the intersection going southbound that you can shorten the cycle length, so give them a little less green time and reallocate that to 202 itself. So we modeled that both moving the crosswalk and adding that southbound through lane, and we were able to reduce the total cycle length. So what that means is we were able to serve all four legs of the intersection more frequently, because what happens when a pedestrian call is put in to cross diagonally across the intersection, that kind of ties up the whole intersection and extends that cycle length, and you're not serving all legs more often. So by moving the crosswalk, by adding that southbound through lane, we're able to reduce that cycle time, serve more of the legs more often, and then enable the north and southbound movements to go with that pedestrian movement shifted to the east.
So here's just a quick understanding the city is very interested in providing input to the study. Just a quick note about providing feedback to us. This is just a sort of a Photoshop shot of the comment form. We sent out the draft report to you all last night, so glad you all are receiving that and reading it. We're looking, we have a 2-week review comment as a period as mentioned by Jed earlier. We absolutely need to get final comments back from the city by Friday, June 14th, a week from this coming Friday, as we need to kind of address final comments from our study partners. We're having both an external review with all the local stakeholders, cities, King County, and the transit agencies, as well as an internal review with our various WashDOT disciplines, including design, active transportation division, public transportation, things like that, because we need to deliver the final study to the legislature on June 30th, the end of this month, as directed by the legislative proviso. In terms of the next steps for the study, again, just noting the June 30th deadline here for submittal. There's a number of implementation actions noted in the report and also some in the matrix here for potential additional analysis, scoping of potential projects if they're of interest to the city or other partners. Some of the alternatives were not really well defined, and so there's potential for further analysis there. Clearly, for the city of Sammamish, one of the big interests is, of course, is going to be Sahalee Way and understanding that you have the 202 Sahalee Way study coming up in your tip soon, that may be an opportunity to better define the performance of this potential recommended option B roundabout, and as Mon indicated, figuring out how that makes the rest of the corridor perform and how that would work. We still need to sort of talk to Redmond to see what their interests are and what they want to focus on, understanding that our opportunities for East Lake Sammamish are fairly limited. As also mentioned, again, the transit options and improvements that King County Metro was working on are primarily these short-term, a lot of these demand-responsive community connection type services. And again, I would just emphasize the importance of the city working closely with Metro on those for the things that you're interested in pursuing. East Link, again, opening in 2024, along with the Sammamish-Sahalee Way park and ride facility on the corridor. The last question, of course, is always the perpetual one of where funding exists, where funding opportunities are there, and grant funding or other funding opportunities in the future. You know, if there's a key priority for the city, is that something you get in your next legislative ask, for example? A very interesting discussion about your TIP and understanding what the city's fiscal issues and concerns are. And funding is always, again, a huge challenge. There's never enough money to really address all the needs and things that we'd like to do out there. So that's where the practical solutions approach hopefully gets us to figuring out where we can do timing for right investments at the right time and in the right location. With that, that's our presentation. So thank you again for the time to present to you, and we welcome your questions.
Councilmember Hornish.
So just a couple questions on the presentation. Mon, you said that, did I hear you right, that did you have engineers out driving in peak hour to calibrate the system? Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that right?
What a concept. Okay. Sorry. Thomas, you said travel times was one thing that were used. Were those measured or were those computed travel times, or how did you do the travel time calculations?
Well, I'll let Mon kick me if I get out of my depth here, but we did both. Again, we had traffic engineers drive the corridor during the morning and evening peak periods.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
And they did actual measuring. They have Mon can describe the program.
So they were out driving the corridor with GPS devices that were recording their position and the time and their speed through the corridor. And so we take that information back, and when we run our models, we're comparing that travel time, this recorded speed, and to the model outputs. So as you're going through the report and looking at the travel times, you'll see that in the PM peak period, for example, going eastbound, the travel times they were experiencing were 11 minutes, but in the model, the PM peak period travel times were 15 minutes. So a little worse than what the engineers experienced as they were going eastbound through the corridor. And then from there, we project forward what the experience would be in 2025 and 2045, adding more volume to the corridor.
After you calibrate it back to the actual.
Exactly,
Yeah, okay.
exactly. And so those travel times, they escalate from what the engineers experienced at the 11, 12 minute to the 15 minute, when what we modeled for the 2018 experience, 2025, that increased to 19, 20 minutes, and then 2045, we're looking at the 30-minute range.
Okay, very good.
So basically, yeah, we did field calibration and then the sim traffic programs projecting out what the travel times were.
And that's typically what you do as an engineer, right? Is calibrate it with a measure?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, very good, thank you.
Councilmember Valderrama.
First of all, I thank you for giving this report. I appreciate the work that you've put into it. I'd like to give a shout out to Senator Dino Rossi and Representative Judy Clibborn, who were the two that were supportive of pushing this forward. When that legislative committee of Mayor Jer and then Bob Keller and myself went, they really went to the wall to push for it. And one of the requests, before I forget, that had been put in by this legislative committee of Councilmember Stuart Ritchie and myself would be to get your estimates for what the detailed design, I think it was the word that you had used early in the presentation, for the next phase would require, because we did have Senator Mancredingra, Representative Springer, and Senator Mullet all said that they'd be very supportive of funding the next phase of this design studies that would be done. So if we could have some of those initial rough orders of magnitude to start priming that pump, we actually have a legislative call tomorrow that we're going to be on. It'd be advantageous just to start to alert them and as to what that magnitude will be when you feel comfortable with a number that for the detailed designs first.
Certainly, we could work with your city staff on this. And when you say detailed designs, are you referring to the corridor entirely, or just in specific
just
intersections?
for these two intersections.
For these two
that you're
intersections.
recommending here. So if we were going to be studying them in more detail and asking
what
the
it would cost.
legislator how many nickels they have to put in, that we have a number of that.
Sure, we could work with your staff to figure that
I
out.
appreciate that if you could get
I'll
that.
need our smart engineers to help us out because I'm the planner, but.
Thank you. The other thing is we were talking about you were driving and you were going back and calibrating. I'd be interested in what you use as your estimate for the capacity for Sahali Way. What's the number you use for that capacity? If you could get that to us, I'd be interested on that.
So I don't have a number off the top of my head for
Yeah,
the
if you could
capacity.
look up what you did for your
Yeah,
modeling, I'd be
it
interested
lives
to
in
see
the-
what you use as the capacity number. Because we've been using a range, and it'd be good if we standardized on something that we're all in agreement with. And then the final thing that I'm curious about, and this goes to the city manager and Cheryl, is assuming, and we could have, given the recommendations, or I should say, given the support we've received from the Senate and the legislators to date, we could put down, assuming this is being done in a number of years here with reasonable assurance, as we've interpreted that, how that affects our model as well. And that could make a big change so that we are able to do something that is a practical solutions model, marries the flexible design here and eases that up. So that should ease some of our work as well in numbers. Thank you.
Okay. I don't have any more lights on. Thank you very much. Council hasn't had an opportunity, unfortunately, to really see it. It came across our desks later this afternoon. And because comments are due, Mr. City Manager, on the 14th, I might suggest that our next meeting, which is a joint meeting with the Parks Commission on the 11th, that we add this study to discuss so that we can collectively get our comments back to them before the 14th. Okay, very good. Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.
Really appreciate
Thank
it. Okay, next is council reports. Let's start down at the end of the dais. Councilmember Valderrama, do you have anything?
No report.
Councilmember Ritchie.
No report.
Councilmember Hornish.
No report.
Okay, great. You have my report. I'm not going to read what's on there, but I do want to add a few things. I attended the North End Mayor's meeting today and got a few interesting things. So Shoreline Mayor Will Hall was there. He serves on the Orca Task Force under Governor Inslee, and they're making some recommendations relative to preserving and restoring habitat for salmon, and that will be part of the Ruckelshaus report on the GMA. So that's just something we should watch for. I think another thing that council, that I'd like to ask our city manager to just scribble down as another thing for a study session, and this may be down the road, maybe in like September, but part of what came out of our meeting today was there will be a lot of regional vacancies through SCA committees next year based on council members that are not seeking reelection. And I think getting a study session so that we as a council can do what a lot of other jurisdictions do, which is target certain SCA committees that we want to serve on so that we can coordinate those efforts. Issaquah does it fairly strategically. So they pick out certain committees like, say, RTC or GMPC, and they say, we want to have representation there, and so they target those.
That's what we normally do at our January retreats.
Well, we talk about who wants to be on what committee, but we don't talk collectively as a jurisdiction to say we want to target these specific committees. So it would still be the same thing in January, where if we say we want to target RTC, then it's up to the body to say who are we going to plug in for that application, for example. So that might be appropriate in September because we want to do it before they open up the application process for next year. Let me see what else I had. One thing that we discussed too, so Metro Connects, which I think has come up a couple times in the study session, came up again today. They have a funding gap to fully realize their plan, which is something for us to be aware of as far as getting additional service here if there's a funding gap. So Seattle did a transportation benefit district, and that expires next year. And SCA in general will be curious to find out if there's an appetite from all of its member cities to find out if we want, instead of having Seattle just go out for its own TBD, whether or not whether municipalities are willing to have some type of funding mechanism to fill in that gap.
Will they be giving us what we should expect from that funding? Because that's been the killer in
Well,
the past, is we fund and Seattle takes. That's why King County Proposition 1 went down with all the East Side voting against it.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that same line of thought. The venue that we were in wasn't appropriate to talk specifically about our concerns about it. It was a conversation in terms of whether or not municipalities will have an appetite for it. But I'm right there with you that, maybe it depends, right? What's in it for us, and whether or not we can get additional service
What's
through
in
it.
it for them?
So King County is looking at sewer capacity charges right now, and specifically how they're a barrier to ADUs. So that's something else that we talked about again tonight. And one point that was brought up is right now, if you build an ADU, you have to pay a sewer capacity charge, which is about $10,000. And they different. So if you have an ADU in your basement, no sewer capacity charge. You build an ADU in your backyard, you pay a sewer capacity charge. So King County Council is looking at how they can basically contend with that because it's a barrier to building ADUs. Sure. So that was something that came up. King County Metro is looking at charging at park and ride lots, targeting specifically those that are heavily used. There's some opposition at the county level on that. But Rod Dembowski, who was present today, said that if they start charging, that the money could be used for technology, like he said, like an app. So you'd have an app on your phone. It would tell you the Bear Creek Park and Ride lot is full, or there's 10 spots there, so that you wouldn't go to a park and ride lot that was heavily used, find out you can't park your car there. But that's just something on the horizon. I don't think that's going to affect Sammamish specifically. Our park and ride, I don't think is fully.
Our parker, I know if I'm 630 Redmond, it's gone. So
Yeah,
I don't need an app to tell me that. So
Yeah,
I know that Issaquah's done.
Yep. So anyway, so that's what came out of the meeting today. Everything else is on my report. Deputy Mayor.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't have any report.
Okay. Councilmember Ross?
No, I'll pass today.
Okay. Our city manager has a report.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. I'm just going to go over item number 3. I have a change to item number 3. Basically, changing the mayor-manager meetings. I'd like the mayor, deputy mayor, and myself, and cut it down to about a half an hour. And this is just going to talk about protocol. Instead of talking in depth about other things. This meeting was originally designed to talk about the council meeting, the protocol, get you up to speed, Deputy Mayor up to speed, anything that we need to do during the council meeting. So that's what I'd like to go back down to. So I'd like to try it out with just the three of us, see how that goes. Then if we need to make modifications and do something different, we can talk about it at that time. But that's what I'd like to do going forward.
Do we trust them?
Okay. Give it a try.
Thank you. Okay. And that's it for me.
Okay.
Mayor, thank you.
All right. We do have an executive session, do we not? Or no?
Property acquisition.
Okay. So we have a executive session. This is for potential property acquisition pursuant to RCW 42.30.110(1)B. How long do we anticipate? How many? Okay. We'll say 30 minutes because now we can 30 minutes.
Well, then we have to extend.
Well, we got to extend. We need a motion to extend just past 10 then.
So moved.
To what?
To 10:10.
10:10. Okay, all those in favor of extending the meeting to 10:10, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Okay, by a vote of 5-1, we're extending to 10:10. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
Yeah, so moved. Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, by a vote of 6-0, we are adjourned.